Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened last summer. My Uncle Rick and I had been planning this fishing trip to Lake Como for months. It's this gorgeous alpine lake tucked away in the Colorado mountains, literally at the end of a jeep trail that most regular vehicles can't handle. We'd taken our four-wheelers up there, loaded with fishing gear and enough supplies for the day. The morning was perfect. Clear blue skies, temperature in the low 70s, just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. We'd had decent luck with the fishing too, caught a few decent-sized trout, nothing record-breaking but enough to make the trip worthwhile. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, we decided to pack it up and head back down the mountain. The weather can change quickly up there, and neither of us wanted to get caught in a surprise thunderstorm. We'd loaded everything onto our four-wheelers and started making our way down the trail. It's not an easy ride. Lots of rocks, tree roots and washed-out sections that require your full attention. We were probably about half a mile from the lake when I noticed something off to the side of the trail. At first glance, it just looked like a really tall tree stump, maybe 40 feet off the road. I remember thinking it was weird because it seemed so much taller than anything else around it. Had to be 7 or 8 feet high. It was this dark, gnarled shape against the green background of the forest. I didn't think much of it until I saw it move. I'm not talking about a slight shift that could have been the wind or a trick of the light. This thing literally straightened up and began walking upright like a person would. I instantly hit my brakes, and I could see my uncle doing the same about 20 feet ahead of me. We both just sat there on our four-wheelers, engines idling, completely frozen. My first rational thought was that it must be a hiker coming out from taking a leak in the woods or something. But within seconds, I knew that wasn't right. This, whatever it was massive, too big to be a normal person. And the way it moved was just fluid, smooth, not like someone stumbling through underbrush. Plus, there was no color variation, no backpack, no hiking poles, no bright outdoor gear that any hiker would have. It was entirely one color, this medium brown shade. Not black like a bear, not the varied colors of clothing, just uniform brown from top to bottom. We watched as it took several long strides, and I mean long strides, like it was covering 3 or 4 feet per step without any effort. Then it just disappeared into the thicker tree line without making a sound. No branches breaking, no leaves rustling, nothing. I looked over at my uncle, and his face was pale. He motioned for me to ride up to where he was. When I got there, he whispered, "Did you see that?" His voice was shaky, which scared me even more because my uncle is an ex-military guy who doesn't get rattled easily. "Yeah," I said. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," he replied. "But it wasn't human." We sat there for another minute, both of us scanning the trees where the thing had disappeared. The forest suddenly seemed a lot darker and more threatening than it had just moments before. "Let's get out of here," I suggested, my hand already reaching for the throttle. But my uncle had a different idea. "Let's go a little further down and then check it out." I thought he was crazy, but I've always followed his lead in the outdoors. He knows what he's doing. So we rode about 400 yards further down the trail to where there was a small clearing where we could safely park our four-wheelers. "We should take a look," he said as he turned off his engine. "Whatever that was, I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of hunting these mountains." I didn't like it, but I agreed. We grabbed our hunting knives, the only weapons we had, and I made sure my phone was in my pocket, though I knew there was no signal up here. We started walking back toward where we'd seen the figure, but instead of staying on the trail, we cut into the forest. The underbrush was thick in spots, and we had to push through pine branches and step over fallen logs. We'd gone about 200 yards when the trees opened up into a small meadow I hadn't known was there. It was maybe 100 yards across, filled with waist-high grass and wildflowers, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. My uncle stopped at the edge of the meadow, scanning the area carefully. "If I were that thing, this is where I'd go," he said quietly. "Let's split up and circle around. You go left, I'll go right. Just stay at the tree line and meet me on the other side." I didn't want to separate, but I nodded and started making my way around the edge of the meadow, staying just inside the trees where I had some cover. I was about halfway around when I saw it. The creature was running, actually running, across the far side of the meadow. In the open sunlight, I could see it much better than before. It wasn't the dark brown I'd first thought. Its fur, and yes, it was definitely fur, was a lighter brown with these reddish tints catching the sun. And it was fast, really fast, moving across uneven ground like it was nothing. I froze where I stood, half hidden behind a pine tree. The thing had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. It was built like a man in the basic shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but everything about it was wrong. The proportions were off. Its shoulders were too broad, its chest and legs too thick. This wasn't someone in a costume. The way it moved was too natural, too fluid. No costume allows that kind of mobility. I wanted to call out to my uncle, but I was afraid to make any sound. The creature disappeared into the trees on the far side of the meadow, and a few moments later, I heard my uncle's low whistle from somewhere to my right. I found him standing at the edge of the trees where the creature had entered. "Did you see it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Follow me," he said, and started carefully making his way into the forest, following what I assumed was the creature's path. We moved slowly, both of us scanning the trees ahead and stopping every few steps to listen. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no squirrels chattering. Just the soft sound of pine needles under our boots. After about 10 minutes of careful tracking, my uncle stopped and pointed at the ground. There, in a patch of soft soil, was a footprint, a very large footprint. It had to be at least 15 inches long and incredibly wide, with what looked like 5 toes at the front. It wasn't a bear print. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for that long, and their prints don't look like giant human feet. It wasn't an elk or deer either. This was something else entirely. "Shit," my uncle whispered. "I wish we had something to make a cast with." I took out my phone and snapped several pictures of the print, trying to get different angles with my hand next to it for scale. There were a few more prints leading deeper into the forest, but then they disappeared, where the ground became rocky and covered with pine needles. We followed the general direction for another 20 minutes, but found nothing else. No more prints, no broken branches, no tufts of fur caught on anything. It was like the creature had simply vanished. The sun was starting to dip lower, creating long shadows through the trees. Neither of us said it, but I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. We didn't want to be in these woods after dark. "Let's head back," my uncle finally said. The walk back to our 4-wheelers seemed to take forever. Every noise, every shadow made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that whatever we'd seen was now following us, watching us from the trees. When we finally reached our vehicles, we didn't waste any time. We fired up the engines and started down the trail much faster than was probably safe on that terrain. Neither of us spoke until we were miles away, back on the main forest road. We pulled over at a spot where a few other vehicles were parked, a trailhead for day hikers. Just seeing other people nearby made me feel safer. "What do you think that was?" I finally asked. My uncle shook his head. "I don't know. I've been hunting these mountains for decades. I've seen bears, mountain lions, every kind of wildlife that lives up here. That wasn't any of them." "You don't think it was a, I couldn't bring myself to say the word. Bigfoot? Sasquatch? He didn't laugh like I expected him to. I've always thought those stories were bullshit. Now, I don't know what to think. When we got home, I immediately downloaded the pictures from my phone. The footprint photos came out clear enough, showing the unusual shape and size compared to my hand. But when I scrolled through, looking for any shots I might have taken of the creature itself, I realized I hadn't gotten any. In the moment, I'd been too shocked, too afraid to think about documentation. It's been 8 months since that day. I've gone back and forth between telling myself it was just a bear walking weird, or some elaborate prank, or even that we both somehow hallucinated the same thing. But I know what I saw. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, the image of that tall, shaggy figure etched into my mind, the way it moved with such unnatural grace through the forest. I haven't been back to Lake Como since then. My uncle says he hasn't either. Some places, once you've seen what's really there, you can never look at the same way again. Story 2. I still can't believe I held on to this story for 40 years without knowing what actually happened to me that day. It's been weighing on me lately, especially since I found that recording online. I need to get this off my chest. It was the fall of '83, early October. I was 21 and pumped about the opening of archery deer season in eastern Oklahoma. Me and 2 buddies from college, Dave and Rick, loaded up my beat-up Chevy pickup and headed east from Tulsa toward the woods outside Tahlequah. We'd been planning this trip for months, saved up for new gear and everything. I remember being so excited I barely slept the night before. We arrived at the National Forest Friday afternoon and found a decent spot to set up camp. Nothing fancy, just a couple tents and a fire ring. The air had that perfect autumn crispness to it, and the leaves were just starting to turn. After we got camp squared away, we grabbed our bows and split up to scout the area before dark. I remember Dave saying something about how we needed to learn the land before hunting it. The forest was dense, lots of oak and hickory, thick underbrush in spots, and these random clearings where the power lines cut through. If you've never seen one of these power line corridors, they're basically long, straight clearings, maybe 100 feet wide, where they've cut down all the trees so the high-tension wires can run through. They make for great hunting spots because deer often use them as travel routes. We spent Friday evening scouting and decided on our hunting spots for the next day. I picked a spot at the edge of one of those power line clearings, right under this massive oak tree that gave me good cover. The clearing had lots of deer sign, tracks, droppings, even some rubs on saplings where bucks had been marking territory. Saturday morning we got up before dawn, had some instant coffee and granola bars, and headed out to our spots. I hunted all morning without seeing much, just a couple does too far away for a shot. Around noon, I headed back to camp for a quick sandwich and to rest for an hour. Around 1 in the afternoon, I was back at my spot, settled in against that oak tree. I was wearing my camo, had my compound bow across my lap, and was just sitting quietly, scanning the edge of the clearing for any movement. It was peaceful, just the occasional breeze rustling the leaves, a few birds calling. I remember feeling really content, just being out there in nature, away from college stress. That's when everything changed. It started with what sounded like branches snapping, not the gentle kind when a squirrel or even a deer moves through the woods, but violent breaking sounds. This was coming from the forest behind me, maybe 50 or 60 yards back in the thick stuff. My first thought was that someone was walking really carelessly through the brush, maybe another hunter. But then I realized no hunter would make that much noise. The crashing got louder and was moving parallel to the clearing, not toward it. Then I heard the sounds. Sounds I've never been able to explain until recently. It was like vocalizations. Not animal calls I recognized, not a person talking, but something in between. The closest thing I can compare it to is if you took human speech and removed all the words, leaving just the cadence and emotion. It was rapid fire, guttural, with this weird rhythm to it. Lots of clicking sounds mixed with what almost sounded like syllables. I froze completely. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Whatever was making these sounds was big. You could tell by how it was moving through the underbrush, breaking branches that would have required significant force. And there was more than one of them. The sounds were coming from at least 2 different locations, like they were talking to each other. This went on for maybe 3 minutes. I was too terrified to move. I kept thinking, is this a bear? Multiple bears. But bears don't vocalize like that. Mountain lions? We didn't have many in Oklahoma, and they don't make sounds like that either. I briefly wondered if it could be people messing with me. But the sounds were too inhuman, and who would be out there doing that? Then, as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. Not just the weird vocalizations, but everything. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just this heavy, oppressive silence that felt even scarier than the noise. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to bolt back to camp, but another part was intensely curious. I've always been that way, needing to understand things. So despite my fear, I slowly stood up, nocked an arrow, for protection, not hunting at this point, and started carefully moving toward where the sounds had come from. The underbrush was incredibly thick, mountain laurel, briars, fallen trees. I pushed through maybe 30 yards before realizing I couldn't go any further without making a ton of noise myself. I stopped and listened again. Nothing. The forest was still unnaturally quiet. I don't know how long I stood there, straining to hear anything, but eventually I gave up and made my way back to my hunting spot. I tried to settle back in and continue hunting, but I couldn't focus. My hands were shaking and I kept looking over my shoulder. Around 4, I called it quits and headed back to camp early. Dave and Rick returned at sunset. They'd both seen deer, but no shots. When they asked how my hunt went, I hesitated before telling them what happened. As I described the sounds, I could see the skepticism on their faces. Rick suggested maybe it was wild hogs. They can make some weird sounds and tear through brush. Dave thought maybe it was other hunters using some kind of predator call to scare away competition. Neither explanation felt right to me, but I didn't have a better one. We stayed out there 2 more days, and I hunted different spots, away from that power line clearing. I didn't hear the sounds again, but I never really relaxed either. On our last night, around the campfire, I brought it up one more time, asking if either of them had ever heard anything like what I described. They hadn't, and the conversation shifted to other things. I could tell they thought I was either exaggerating or had misinterpreted normal forest sounds. For years afterward, I occasionally thought about that day, but without any context for what I'd heard, I eventually filed it away as one of those unexplained experiences everyone has. I continued hunting, went on with my life, got married, had kids, and the memory faded. Fast forward to about 2 months ago. I was watching some wildlife videos on YouTube, and the algorithm suggested something called unexplained forest sounds. I clicked on it out of curiosity, and about halfway through the video, they played a recording labeled Samurai Chatter, captured in the Pacific Northwest in 2012. I literally dropped my phone. The sounds in that recording were almost exactly what I'd heard in those Oklahoma woods 40 years earlier. The same rapid-fire, speech-like patterns, the same guttural quality, the same weird clicks and non-words. I must have replayed that clip 20 times, my skin crawling with each listen. I went down a rabbit hole after that, researching these sounds. I found them associated with Bigfoot encounters, which honestly made me roll my eyes at first. I've never been one for cryptids or conspiracy theories, but the more accounts I read from people who'd heard these same sounds, the more similarities I found with my experience. The sounds often came from multiple sources, happened near power line clearings or other open corridors, and were frequently described as an intimidation tactic. Looking back with this new context, things started making more sense. The power line clearing I was sitting at would have been a natural travel route for any large creature moving through the forest. I was essentially blocking their path. The sounds and branch breaking were likely, meant to scare me away without having to reveal themselves. And instead of running, what did I do? I walked toward them. I cringe now thinking about how naive that was. Whatever I encountered that day could have easily overwhelmed me if they'd wanted to. I was alone in remote woods, armed with only a bow and arrow. I've told my wife about this realization, and she thinks I'm having a midlife crisis at 61, trying to make an ordinary experience into something extraordinary. Maybe she's right, but I know what I heard, and now I know others have heard it too. What haunts me most is wondering how close I came to them when I pushed into that underbrush. Were they watching me from just a few yards away? Could I have reached out and touched one if I'd gone just a little further? The thought makes my stomach turn. I haven't been back to those specific woods since, though I've hunted other areas of Oklahoma many times. Part of me wants to go back with better recording equipment and see if I can capture anything. Another part of me knows that whatever I encountered that day is probably long gone, or if they're still there, I might not be so lucky a second time. I don't know what to make of all this, even now. All I know is that what I heard that October afternoon in '83 was real. It wasn't any animal I recognized then or since, and I was probably in a lot more danger than I realized at the time. I'm just grateful that whatever they were, they chose to warn me off rather than confront me directly. Story 3. I've been going to Chalk Creek in Summit County since I was a kid. It's about an hour and a half east of Salt Lake City, and it's always been my go-to spot for cutthroat trout. My brother-in-law Mark and I try to go fishing there at least once a year. He married my sister 12 years ago, and he's basically become the brother I never had. This happened last summer, in July. We'd planned this trip for weeks, and I was especially looking forward to it because work had been brutal. I needed some time away from spreadsheets and fluorescent lighting, just me, Mark, our fishing gear, and the sound of running water. We arrived at our usual spot around noon. It was one of those perfect Utah summer days, warm but not too hot, clear blue sky, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. The creek was running clear, and we could see the trout darting around in the deeper pools. I remember feeling this wave of relief wash over me as soon as my boots hit the water. This was exactly what I needed. The fishing was decent that day. I caught 4 cutthroats, and Mark landed 5. We were planning to keep a few for dinner, but honestly, the catching wasn't really the point. It was just about being out there. We lost track of time, which happens a lot when you're fishing. I remember checking my watch and realizing it was already past 6 in the evening. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and the light was changing. Anyone who's spent time in the mountains knows how quickly darkness falls once the sun starts to set. We decided to pack up and head back to the truck before we'd have to navigate the canyon in the dark. The hike out isn't particularly difficult, but it's not a marked trail either. You have to climb up from the creek bed, through some rocky terrain, and then across a small meadow before you reach the dirt road where we'd parked. Mark was ahead of me by maybe 15 feet. We weren't talking much, just focused on getting back before darkness fell completely. We'd just crested a small rise and entered the meadow when I saw Mark freeze. His body language changed instantly, went from relaxed to rigid in a split second. I stopped too, scanning the area to see what had caught his attention. That's when I saw it. Something dark, almost black, moving quickly across the far side of the meadow toward a stand of pines. It wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of bears in the Utah backcountry, and they don't move like this thing did. It was smooth, fluid, but powerful, like it was gliding across the ground rather than walking or running. Before I could even process what I was seeing, it reached the edge of the pine trees. Then it made this sound. God, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was this deep, resonating exhale, almost like someone letting out a breath they'd been holding for hours, but amplified and distorted. It didn't sound like anything I've ever heard in nature before. As it entered the trees, one of the pine boughs flipped up into the air. Must have been 5 feet high at least. Like the thing had either brushed it back or deliberately thrown it. The movement was too forceful to be just from passing by. Mark turned his head slightly toward me without taking his eyes off the tree line and whispered, "What the hell was that?" His voice sounded strangled, like he was forcing the words out. I noticed his hand move toward the rifle slung over his shoulder. I had mine too. We always carry them as a precaution against mountain lions or aggressive moose. The pine stand wasn't big, maybe the size of my front yard back home, and I could see there was another clearing just behind it. This thing, whatever it was, couldn't have gone far. We stood there, completely still, straining to see or hear anything. That's when we heard it again. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the air, followed by this bizarre chattering sound, like teeth clicking together rapidly, but heavy and loud. Not like the chittering of a squirrel or smaller animal. This was substantial, powerful. I've encountered dangerous wildlife before. I've had a black bear bluff charge me on the Wasatch Front. I've rounded a corner on a trail and come face to face with a bull moose during rutting season. I once even spotted a mountain lion watching me from a ridge while I was setting up camp. But the fear I felt in those moments was nothing compared to what washed over me in that meadow. It wasn't just the normal fear of a wild animal that might hurt me. It was deeper, more primal. It felt like we had stepped into something's territory. Something that wasn't supposed to exist, and it knew we were there. It felt like we had broken some unspoken rule by being in that place at that time. I looked at Mark, and I could tell he felt it too. His face had gone pale, and there was sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. We didn't need to speak. We both knew we needed to get out of there. We started backing away slowly, keeping our eyes fixed on that stand of pines. Mark had unsung his rifle and was holding it at the ready. I did the same, though some part of me wondered if it would even matter if that thing decided to come for us. The sun was sinking fast now, and the meadow was filling with shadows. Every dark spot, every movement caused by the breeze seemed threatening. We kept backing up until we reached the rise we'd come over, then turned and moved more quickly down toward where we'd parked the truck. Neither of us spoke until we were in the truck with the doors locked. Mark's hands were shaking as he put the key in the ignition. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice still not sounding quite right. "Yeah," I said. "I saw it." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Finally, Mark spoke again. "What do you think it was?" I shook my head. "I don't know. Not a bear." "No, definitely not a bear," he agreed. "Wrong shape, and bears don't move like that." "Not a moose either," I said. "Too dark, wrong profile." "Mountain lion?" he suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "I don't think so." I worked at Lagoon in Farmington one summer during college, helping with the small zoo they have there. They had this leopard that would make a similar sound when it was agitated. That heavy, rumbling growl, but this was deeper, more powerful. And the chattering. I've never heard a big cat make a sound like that. We spent the entire drive home trying to rationalize what we'd seen and heard. Maybe it was some unusual combination of known animals. Maybe the light and shadows played tricks on us. Maybe it was just a bear moving in an odd way because it was injured or startled. But neither of us really believed any of those explanations. I've been back to Utah's wilderness dozens of times since then. I still fish, still hike, still camp. But I haven't been back to Chalk Creek. I can't bring myself to go there, especially not as the day wanes toward evening. Mark hasn't talked about it much. When my sister asked how our trip went, he just said it was fine, that we caught some fish. But sometimes I catch him staring off into the distance with this troubled look on his face, and I know he's thinking about it too. I still don't know what we saw that evening. I just know what it wasn't. It wasn't any animal I've ever encountered in over 30 years of exploring Utah's backcountry. It moved wrong. It sounded wrong. It felt wrong. Sometimes I wake up at night hearing that deep exhalation followed by the chattering sound. And I wonder if it's still there, moving through the pines at the edge of that meadow, waiting for someone else to stumble into its territory. I used to think I knew every creature that called these mountains home. Now I'm not so sure. There are remote places in these ranges where people rarely go, deep canyons and dense forests that could hide things we don't understand. All I know for certain is that there was something in that stand of pines in Chalk Creek that doesn't appear in any wildlife guide. And the fear I felt wasn't just the normal caution of encountering a predator. It was the fear of something unknown, something that shouldn't exist but does. I still fish, I still hunt, I'm still comfortable in the wilderness. But now I always make sure I'm back to my truck before the sun starts to set, and I always keep my eyes on the tree line. Story 4. I've been debating whether to post this for almost 2 years now. It feels weird to finally type it out, but I need to tell someone who won't immediately laugh it off or give me that look. You know the one. The "oh, this person's lost it" look. This happened in Bowser on Vancouver Island about 2 years ago. My husband Nathan and I were collecting firewood for the winter. We'd found this old logging road cutting through a clear-cut area, one of those spots where they'd harvested most of the trees, but left a mess of fallen logs and smaller stuff behind, perfect for firewood gathering if you don't mind the work. It was early October, starting to get chilly, but still nice enough during the day. We brought our son Oliver with us. He was 4.5 at the time. He's always been a good kid, pretty level-headed for a preschooler. Not the type to make up wild stories or anything like that. The spot we found was perfect. The logging road gave us easy access, and there was this big open space, maybe 150 feet or so, between the road and where the actual dense forest began again. Lots of fallen timber to collect without having to venture too deep into the woods. We'd been working for maybe an hour. Oliver had gotten bored watching us saw and load wood into the back of our pickup, so he was sitting in the cab playing with some toys we'd brought along. The windows were down since it wasn't too cold, and he could call out to us if he needed anything. We could see him perfectly fine from where we were working, maybe 20 feet from the truck. I remember I was bent over, trying to break a branch into a manageable size, when I heard Oliver's voice, not scared, but excited. "Mommy! Mommy, look! Look over there!" I straightened up, my back aching a bit, and looked over at the truck. Oliver was half hanging out the passenger window, pointing frantically toward the tree line where the clear cut met the dense forest. "What is it, buddy?" I called back, not really concerned. Kids get excited about deer, eagles, whatever. "There's something big over there, by the trees. It's running." Nathan had stopped working too, both of us instinctively scanning the tree line. I didn't see anything at first and figured it was probably a deer or maybe a black bear. We see them around here pretty often. "What did you see, Ollie?" Nathan asked, walking closer to the truck. Oliver was practically bouncing in his seat now. "It was huge, Daddy. Tall like a grown-up, but all hairy. Dark brown, almost black. It ran super fast and jumped on that big log." He was pointing to a massive fallen tree near the forest edge. From where we stood, it was just a dark shape against the backdrop of the standing forest. I remember exchanging a look with Nathan. We both smiled, that parent smile. You know, the "isn't that cute, he's imagining things" smile. "Was it a bear, sweetie?" I asked, walking back to work. "Bears can look really big sometimes." Oliver shook his head emphatically. "No, Mommy, bears don't walk like people. This walked like people, on 2 legs, and it had arms that went like this." He started swinging his arms back and forth, mimicking a walking motion. It ran super fast across the open part and jumped on the log. Then it looked at us and went into the trees. Something about how specific he was being made the hair on my arms stand up. Not because I believed him necessarily, but because of how convinced he was. There wasn't a trace of that mischievous look kids get when they're making things up. Nathan chuckled. Well, buddy, that's pretty cool. Maybe it was a bear standing up for a better look. It wasn't a bear, Oliver insisted, his little face serious. I know what bears look like. We went back to gathering wood, but I kept glancing at the tree line. Nothing moved except the branches swaying in the breeze. After about 20 more minutes, we'd loaded enough and decided to head home. On the drive back, Oliver kept talking about what he'd seen. It was so tall, taller than Daddy, and all covered in dark hair. Not fur like a bear, more like hair, and it moved so fast, but on two legs, like people walk. I turned in my seat to look at him. Oliver, are you sure it wasn't just a bear? Bears can stand up sometimes. He shook his head firmly. No, Mommy, it wasn't a bear. It was something else. It ran like a person runs, but super fast. That night, as I tucked Oliver into bed, he asked me something that gave me chills. Mommy, are there people who live in the forest? Big hairy people? I didn't know what to say. No, sweetie. People live in houses, not forests. Maybe what you saw was just a bear that looked different because of how the light was. He looked at me with those serious eyes. It wasn't a bear, Mommy. I saw it really good. It was like a person, but not a person. I kissed his forehead and turned out the light, figuring he'd forget about it by morning. But he didn't forget. The next day, he asked the same questions, and the day after that. His description never changed or got more elaborate. It was always the same. A tall, dark-haired figure that walked upright like a human, ran across the clearing, jumped onto a log, looked at them, and disappeared into the forest. About a week after the incident, we were watching TV when a documentary about wildlife came on. Oliver suddenly got super excited when they showed a segment about unexplained creatures. That's it! That's what I saw! He shouted, pointing at the screen. It was a blurry image of what the documentary called a Sasquatch, or Bigfoot. My blood went cold. We had never exposed Oliver to Bigfoot stories or shows. We weren't into that kind of stuff, and he was too young for scary movies. How did he know to connect what he saw with this? Oliver, Nathan asked carefully, have you ever heard of Bigfoot before? Oliver shook his head. No, but that's what I saw in the forest. That's the forest person. From that day on, Oliver became obsessed with Bigfoot. He begged to watch documentaries about it. He drew pictures of what he saw, always the same figure, tall, dark-haired, walking upright. The drawings were crude, obviously, since he was only 4, but the consistency was unnerving. I started wondering if maybe he had seen something, not necessarily a Bigfoot, I wasn't ready to go there, but something he couldn't explain with his limited knowledge of the world. Maybe a bear in weird lighting, maybe a hunter wearing dark clothes, maybe just a shadow that moved in a strange way. But then I kept coming back to the fact that he identified this creature as a Bigfoot without ever having been exposed to the concept before, and his description never wavered or got more fantastic over time, as kids' stories usually do. One night, about a month after the incident, I decided to really talk to him about it. I sat on the edge of his bed during story time. Oliver, remember that day when we were getting firewood and you saw something in the forest? He nodded eagerly. The Bigfoot. I want you to really think hard. Are you absolutely sure about what you saw? It's okay if you made it up or if you're not sure anymore. His face got serious, that look that's so strange on a little kid's face. Mommy, I'm sure. I saw it with my own eyes. It was big and hairy and dark. It walked like us, but faster. It jumped on the big log and looked at us, then it went away into the trees. But honey, most grown-ups don't believe Bigfoot is real. He just shrugged. They didn't see it. I did. It's been 2 years now. Oliver is 6 and a half. He still talks about what he saw. The story has never changed, not one detail. He's never embellished it or added new elements. If anything, his memory of it seems clearer now than it was then. Since that day, Oliver scans the forest whenever we go hiking or camping. He's constantly looking for signs, broken branches, weird footprints, anything unusual. He watches every documentary about Bigfoot he can find. He's become our family expert on the subject. Sometimes I catch him staring into the trees behind our house with a serious, searching look no 6-year-old should have. When I ask what he's doing, he always says the same thing: looking for the forest person. Last month we went back to that same area to get firewood again. Oliver insisted on coming. The whole time we were there, he sat in the truck, eyes fixed on the tree line. He didn't play with his toys or complain about being bored. He just watched. As we were getting ready to leave, he said something that sent ice through my veins. "It's still here, Mummy. I can feel it watching us." I looked at the dense wall of trees in the distance. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, something dark shifting between the trunks. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. I'm not saying my son saw Bigfoot that day in Bowser. I'm really not. But I am saying that something happened that I can't explain. A 4-year-old with no prior knowledge of Bigfoot saw something that he immediately identified as a Sasquatch when he first saw an image of one. And 2 years later, his story hasn't changed one bit. Sometimes I find myself scanning the tree line too, wondering. Vancouver Island has more reported Bigfoot sightings than almost anywhere else in Canada. The First Nations people here have stories about wild men of the woods going back centuries. I don't know what Oliver saw that day. Part of me hopes it was just his imagination. But another part, the part that sees how certain he still is, how his eyes still light up when he talks about it, that part wonders if maybe, just maybe, there are things in these forests that we don't understand. All I know for sure is that my son saw something that day that changed him. And sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees behind our house, I catch myself looking a little more carefully at the shadows between the trunks, wondering what might be looking back. Story 5. I've been a hunter for over 30 years now. I know my way around the forests of Washington state like the back of my hand. I've tracked black bear, shot deer, encountered cougars, you name it. I've seen just about everything these woods have to offer. At least that's what I thought until November of 2002. I still get goosebumps thinking about that morning. It was the 3rd day of deer season, and I'd been up since 4 in the morning. The air was bitter cold, maybe 35 degrees, with that kind of stillness you only get in the mountains before sunrise. My breath was coming out in thick white clouds as I walked along this old logging road about 15 miles east of Darrington. I remember everything about that day with perfect clarity. I was wearing my orange vest over my camouflage jacket, had my Winchester .308 slung over my shoulder, and was carrying a small pack with some jerky, water, and basic supplies. Just a normal hunting day. The sun was just starting to come up, not quite over the mountains yet, but lighting up the sky enough that I didn't need my headlamp anymore. I'd been walking for about an hour when it happened. I was scanning the tree line for any movement, which is just what you do when you're hunting. Force of habit. The road was running along a slight ridge, with a downslope to my right that led into a thick alder swamp. Not great deer country, but there was an open meadow beyond it that sometimes had good activity. At first, I just noticed movement. About 200 yards ahead, something big and dark was moving on the road. My first thought was, black bear. They're common enough in that area, and it's not unusual to see them foraging in the early morning. I remember feeling a little excited. I wasn't bear hunting, but it's always cool to see them. But something felt off right away. The way it was moving, it wasn't right for a bear. It was walking directly toward me, which isn't typical bear behavior to begin with, and it was upright. Now, I've seen plenty of bears stand up on their hind legs to get a better look or smell at something, but they don't typically walk that way for any distance. I stopped and slowly raised my rifle, not to shoot, but to use the scope for a better look. That's when my blood went cold. Through the scope, I could see it clearly, and this was no bear. The thing was massive. If I had to guess, it was maybe 7 feet tall. But what struck me most was how incredibly wide it was. The shoulders had to be at least 3 feet across. It was covered in what looked like dark blackish-brown hair or fur. Not shaggy like a bear's, but shorter, more uniform, and it was walking completely upright on 2 legs. The proportions were all wrong for a person in a suit. The arms were too long, hanging down almost to the knees, and the torso was too broad and barrel-shaped. The head sat directly on the shoulders, with barely any neck visible. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but the head seemed conical, sloping back from what might have been a brow ridge. I've been hunting these woods for decades. I know what a bear looks like, even from a distance. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person either. When I crouched down to steady my rifle for a better look, the thing stopped dead in its tracks. It was at least 150 yards away, but it noticed that tiny movement I made instantly. That's when I knew for sure this wasn't normal. Even a cautious animal shouldn't have been able to detect such a small motion from that distance. It stood completely still for maybe 3 seconds, and I swear it was looking right at me. Then, without any warning, it turned and moved off the road toward the alder swamp. This is where things get even stranger. It didn't drop to all fours like a bear would. It ran while staying upright, but hunched forward, almost like someone running while doubled over with a stomach cramp. Its arms swung slightly at its sides, not flailing wildly, but moving in a controlled, almost human-like manner. The speed was what really got me. This thing covered ground faster than any human could, especially through thick underbrush. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the alder thicket. I stayed there, frozen in place, for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. Part of me wanted to turn around and get the hell out of there, but another part, the hunter in me, I guess, needed to know what I'd just seen. I walked forward slowly, rifle ready, all my senses on high alert. I've tracked wounded animals before, and I know how dangerous they can be, but this was different. I wasn't tracking prey anymore. I was investigating something unknown, and that's a whole different kind of scary. When I reached the spot where it had left the road, I looked for tracks. The ground was mostly covered in moss and fallen leaves, so there weren't clear footprints, but I could see where something heavy had disturbed the moss. Following the trail with my eyes, I could make out where it had moved through some wet ground, leaving large, deep impressions in the mud. They weren't clear enough to make out details, but whatever made them was big and heavy. I stood at the edge of that alder thicket for maybe 5 minutes, staring into it. The trees were dense enough that I couldn't see more than 20 feet in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that's not normal. When the forest goes quiet, it usually means there's a predator around. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up. I've faced down charging black bears and once had a close encounter with a mountain lion, but I've never felt fear like I did standing there. It was primal. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave. I backed away slowly, keeping my rifle ready, and retreated down the road the way I'd come. I didn't run. Running triggers a predator's chase instinct, but I moved as quickly as I could while still staying alert. It took me almost 2 hours to get back to my truck, and I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time. Here's the thing that still bothers me the most. I'm not some inexperienced hiker who saw a shadow and let my imagination run wild. I've spent my whole adult life outdoors. I know every animal in these woods. I had a clear view of this thing through a high-powered scope at relatively close range in good morning light. What I saw wasn't a bear standing up momentarily or a person in a costume. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural. and the way it detected my tiny movement from that distance wasn't normal. When I got home, I told my wife about it. She thought maybe it was just a bear that looked strange from that angle, or possibly another hunter in dark clothing, but she didn't see what I saw. The breadth of those shoulders, the way it ran while staying upright, the immediate reaction to my presence. None of that fits anything I know. I've only told a few close friends about this. Most people would probably think I'm crazy or that I was seeing things. I've questioned it myself countless times, but I know what I saw that morning. I've been back to those woods many times since then, though never alone. I haven't seen anything like it again, but sometimes when I'm out there, I get that same feeling of being watched. The silence falls, and the hairs on my arms stand up. I don't know what's out there in the forests of Washington. I don't know if it was what some people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, or if it's something else entirely. All I know is that it was real. It was intelligent enough to detect me and avoid me, and it moved through that forest like it belonged there more than I did. It's been over 20 years now, and I've never forgotten a single detail of what I saw that morning. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I can still see it clearly in my mind. That massive, dark figure walking toward me in the cold morning light. And I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 6. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what happened to me back in '94. I've told this story to family, a few close friends, and once to a forest ranger who just nodded politely and probably thought I was nuts. But I need to get this out there because I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'm tired of keeping it bottled up. It was early October 1994, just before hunting season really kicked off. I'd gone up into the mountains in Douglas County, about 18 miles off Highway 395. I know those woods like the back of my hand. Been hunting there since I was a kid with my dad. I'm Washoe, and these mountains are part of our ancestral land. I've always felt connected to them, comfortable there. At least I did until that day. I'd driven my old Ford pickup deep into the forest to cut some firewood for winter. It was a crisp, clear day, perfect weather for being outdoors. I remember the smell of pine sap and the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. I'd loaded up pretty good, had the bed of my truck nearly full with split pine when the whole trip went sideways. I was backing up to get around a tight spot between some trees when I heard a crack and felt the truck lurch. Thought I'd hit a stump at first, but when I got out to check, I saw a piece of thick brush had somehow snagged and ripped my transmission line clean off. Fluid was leaking everywhere. I'm decent with vehicles, but this wasn't something I could fix with the tools I had on hand. I tried the radio, but up there, surrounded by mountains, I couldn't get a signal. Cell phones weren't really a thing yet, at least not for regular folks like me. I checked my watch. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. I figured I had about 4 hours of daylight left. My choices were limited: stay with the truck overnight and hope someone came looking, or start walking. My family knew roughly where I was headed, but the area's huge, and they wouldn't start worrying until nightfall. I decided to start walking back toward the highway. 18 miles is a long way, but I thought I could at least get to one of the more traveled forest roads before dark. I grabbed my rifle, a 30-06 Springfield I've had for years, some water, a couple energy bars, and my jacket. The temperature was already starting to drop as the sun moved lower. I knew the way back, or at least I thought I did. All those forest roads can start looking the same after a while. After about 3 hours of walking, I'd covered maybe 8 miles. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. I'd been following game trails when I could, trying to avoid the roughest terrain. The area is all pine and juniper forest with these deeply cut ravines. It's rocky as hell too, which slowed me down more than I'd expected. The light was fading fast, and I was starting to think I should find a spot to hunker down for the night when I heard it. I've been in those woods my whole life. I've heard elk bugling, coyotes howling, even a mountain lion scream once. But this This was something else entirely. It started as a low moan that built into a scream that made every hair on my body stand up. It was loud, impossibly loud, and had this quality to it that was almost human but twisted somehow. Higher pitched than a bear, more guttural than an elk. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. I literally jumped about 2 feet in the air. No exaggeration, pure instinct. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I saw movement about 50 meters to my south. At first I thought it was a bear, but as I focused I realized it was walking upright. In the fading light, I could make out a massive silhouette moving between the trees. It was huge, at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and bulky. Not like a person in a coat, but naturally massive through the shoulders and chest. The thing that really got me was how it moved. It wasn't clumsy or awkward, like you'd expect something that big to be. It moved with purpose, deliberately. And as it walked, it was breaking branches, not small twigs, but actual branches and small trees. I could hear the wood snapping and cracking as it pushed through the forest. The creature screamed again, and I swear I felt it in my chest. That's when I realized it was moving toward me, not directly, but at an angle that would intercept my path. I don't know if it had seen me or smelled me, but it knew I was there. I'm not ashamed to say I panicked. I raised my rifle and fired a volley of shots over its head, about 10 rounds in quick succession. I wasn't trying to hit it, just scare it off. The sound of the rifle echoed through the trees, and for a moment, everything went silent. The creature had stopped moving. Even in the growing darkness, I could see its massive outline standing perfectly still among the trees. For a few seconds that felt like hours. We were at a standoff. Me with my rifle, it with its whatever it was. Then it let out another one of those screams, and I felt my knees go weak. But instead of continuing toward me, it changed direction. It started moving away, up a ridge to my right. As it went, I could hear it still breaking trees, still occasionally letting out those terrible sounds. I stood frozen, watching until it crested the ridge and disappeared from sight. I've never felt relief like that in my life. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my rifle. I had to sit down for a minute just to get myself together. The forest had gone quiet again, except for the pounding of my heart and my ragged breathing. When I managed to get back on my feet, I started walking again, faster this time. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen, terrified I'd hear that scream again, or the sound of something massive moving through the trees behind me. I kept my rifle ready, though I only had a handful of rounds left after firing those warning shots. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't been armed. Would it have attacked me? Would anyone have ever found my body? Or would I have just been another missing person in the vast wilderness? The darkness was complete now, but the moon provided enough light to see the road. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, trying not to think about what was out there in the black spaces between the trees. I'd been walking for maybe another hour when I saw headlights coming up the road. My family had gotten worried when I didn't come home and had started searching the roads I normally took. I've never been so happy to see my brother-in-law's beat-up Chevy in my life. They said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I probably did. I tried to explain what happened, but the words just wouldn't come out right. How do you tell someone you saw a monster in the woods without sounding crazy? I just said I'd heard something weird and got spooked after my truck broke down. It wasn't until a few days later that I went to talk to my uncle, one of the tribal elders. I told him everything. The scream, the massive figure, how it broke trees as it walked. He didn't laugh or look at me like I was losing my mind. He just nodded and said, "You met Honowiwi." According to our traditions, Honowiwi is a powerful spirit that takes the form of a giant, hairy, man-like creature that lives in the mountains. White folks would call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but to us, it's something more complex. Not just an animal, but a being that exists in both our world and the spirit world. My uncle told me stories that had been passed down for generations about encounters just like mine. Same area, same description, same bone-chilling screams. He said I was lucky, that Honowiwi could have easily killed me if it wanted to, but instead it chose to leave me alone after I fired my warning shots. That was 29 years ago now, but I still think about it almost every day. I still hunt in those mountains, but never in that specific area, and never alone. I always carry extra ammunition too, just in case. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I've heard that scream again. My wife says I talk in my sleep on those nights, trying to warn someone about something in the woods. I've looked into other reports of similar encounters over the years. There are more than you'd think, especially in that part of Nevada. Most people are too embarrassed to come forward publicly, afraid of being labeled crazy or attention-seeking. I understand that fear all too well. I don't know for certain what I saw that night. Was it really Honowiwi, the spirit creature from our traditions? Was it a Sasquatch like the ones people report seeing all over the Pacific Northwest? Or was it something else entirely, something science hasn't classified yet? What I do know is that it was real. It wasn't a bear, wasn't an elk, wasn't a person in a costume. The sound it made wasn't something that could be imitated by any animal I know. And its size and strength, the way it broke those trees, that wasn't something a person could fake. That night changed my relationship with the wilderness. I still love these mountains, still feel connected to them as part of my heritage. But now I know they hold secrets. Things that exist in the shadows and deep ravines, things that most people will go their whole lives without encountering. And maybe that's for the best. There's a reason these creatures stay hidden, a reason they avoid humans when they can. I think we're meant to share this world with them, but from a distance. They have their territory, and we have ours. It's when those territories overlap that the trouble starts. I sometimes wonder if it's still out there, that specific creature I encountered. Does it remember me like I remember it? Does it tell its own kind about the human who fired his gun into the air that autumn evening long ago? I'll never go looking for it. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, just respected from afar. But I'll never forget that scream, or the silhouette of something impossible moving through the trees as darkness fell on the mountains of Douglas County. Story 7. I've spent my whole life in the outdoors. Grew up hunting with my dad in eastern Oklahoma. Got my first compound bow when I was 10, and have probably logged more nights under the stars than some park rangers. I'm not saying this to brag, just want to establish that I know the woods, I know animals, and I know the difference between normal forest sounds and something that doesn't belong. What happened back in 2013 still gives me chills when I think about it. I've told this story maybe 3 times total, and each time people look at me like I'm either lying or crazy. I get it. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't been there. It was our annual spring camping trip at Broken Bow Lake. Me, my brother Mike, and my son Tyler, who was 12 at the time. We'd been doing this trip for years, always the same weekend in May, when the crappie are biting and the weather's perfect. We had a whole crew that year, Mike's wife Sarah, my wife Jen, and a couple other families. But this story is about just the 3 of us. We arrived Friday afternoon and got camp set up along the eastern shore. It was a good spot, about 20 yards from the water with enough tree cover to keep the morning sun from cooking us in our tents. After dinner, around 9:30, I suggested we take the boat out for some night fishing. The lake is incredible after dark. You can see every star in the sky out there with no city lights for miles. Mike was up for it, and Tyler begged to come along. The kid loves fishing more than video games, which makes me proud. We grabbed our tackle boxes, rods, a cooler with some waters and a few beers for me and Mike, and headed down to where we had the boat moored. It's just a simple 16-foot aluminum fishing boat with a small outboard, nothing fancy. The night was dead still. No wind, no clouds, just a 3/4 moon reflecting off the water. Temperature was perfect, maybe 65 degrees. As we pushed off, I remember thinking how quiet it was. Usually you hear all kinds of night sounds, frogs, insects, the occasional owl. But that night was oddly silent. I didn't think much of it at the time. Mike suggested we try a cove on the north side of the lake that had been productive in previous years. It's about a 20-minute ride from our campsite, tucked away behind a small peninsula. The place feels more like Canada than Oklahoma. Tall pines right down to the water's edge, steep hills rising up around the cove, and water so clear you can sometimes see 15 feet down on a sunny day. We cut the motor as we entered the cove and used the trolling motor to position ourselves about 30 yards from shore. The silence was almost physical once the engine stopped. You could hear water dripping off the oars. We baited our hooks, night crawlers for Tyler, jigs for Mike and me, and cast out. For about 45 minutes, everything was normal. Tyler caught 2 small bass, which he was thrilled about. Mike and I hadn't had any luck yet. We were talking quietly, just shooting the breeze about work and sports, when it happened. There was a massive splash about 10 yards to our left. Not like a fish jumping. This was huge, like someone had dropped a cinder block from 20 feet up. Water sprayed across the boat, hitting my arm. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, already reaching for the flashlight. "Maybe a big catfish?" I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew better. I've seen 6-foot catfish breach the water, and this was different. Before Mike could turn on the flashlight, there was another splash. Closer this time, maybe 6 or 7 yards away. The boat actually rocked from the wave it created. This time I saw what caused it. A rock, easily the size of a bowling ball, hit the water and sank immediately. A cold feeling spread through my chest. We were in the middle of a cove, at least 30 yards from the nearest shore. Rocks don't just fall from the sky. Mike finally got the flashlight working and aimed it toward the shoreline. The beam barely reached, illuminating just the first few feet of trees and underbrush. Nothing moved in the light. "Dad?" Tyler's voice was small, and I could feel him pressing against my side. "What's throwing rocks?" "I don't know, Bud," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just some teenagers messing around." But even as I said it, I knew it was bullshit. We were at least 4 miles from any road or campsite. Nobody would hike all that way in the dark just to throw rocks at a random boat. Mike and I locked eyes. My brother is 6'3", 200 pounds, and I've never seen him scared of anything. But in that moment, I saw real fear on his face. Then we heard it, movement in the brush along the shoreline, not like a deer moving through undergrowth. This was heavy, deliberate, branches breaking, leaves rustling. Whatever it was big, and it was moving parallel to our position. "Let's get out of here," Mike said, already reaching for the outboard starter. That's when the third rock hit. This one smashed into the water right beside the boat, so close that water flooded over the gunwale and soaked our feet. This wasn't just a rock. This was a boulder, something that would take a grown man 2 hands to lift. As Mike yanked on the starter cord, I swung the flashlight toward where I thought the rock had come from. For just a split second, I caught movement, something large moving between 2 trees. The flashlight wasn't powerful enough to cut through the darkness effectively, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't a person. The shape was all wrong. Too big, I don't even know how to describe it, just wrong. The outboard sputtered to life and Mike gunned it. We shot out of that cove like we were being chased by the devil himself. Tyler was crying silently, his hands gripping my arms so tight they left marks I found the next morning. As we sped away, I kept the flashlight trained on the shore behind us. About 50 yards out, I saw movement again. Something emerging from the tree line onto a rocky outcropping that jutted into the water. The flashlight beam caught it for just a moment before we rounded the peninsula and lost sight of the cove. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. It could have been a bear standing on its hind legs. We do have black bears in southeastern Oklahoma, but I've hunted bear before, and this didn't move like one. It was too tall, too upright. And bears don't throw rocks with that kind of accuracy or power. When we got back to camp, it was just after 11. We woke up our wives, partly because we needed to tell someone what happened, and partly because none of us wanted to be the only ones awake. Sarah thought we were pulling her leg at first, but one look at Tyler's face convinced her we weren't joking. We stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning, sitting around the campfire, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. I kept my rifle close, something I've never felt the need to do before while camping. The next morning in daylight, everything seemed ridiculous. The women suggested maybe it was some local kids playing a dangerous prank. Tyler asked if we could go back to the cove during the day to look for tracks, but there was no way in hell I was taking my son back there. We decided to move our campsite that day, relocating to the western side of the lake near the marina where there were other people around. We didn't do any more night fishing that trip. I've been back to Broken Bow many times since then, but I've never returned to that specific cove. I've also done a lot of research on the area, looking for similar stories or local legends, but found nothing conclusive. The Choctaw Nation has lands not far from there, and there are some old stories about forest spirits, but nothing that matches what we experienced. Mike refuses to talk about it anymore. When I brought it up last Christmas, he just shook his head and changed the subject. Tyler, now in his 20s, still remembers every detail. He told me recently that he sometimes has nightmares about it, about being in that boat and seeing something massive moving through the trees toward him. I don't know what was in those woods that night. I don't know why it wanted us gone from that cove so badly. All I know is that in all my years of hunting and fishing, I've never felt that kind of primal fear before or since. Something intelligent enough to throw rocks with accuracy, strong enough to hurl boulders that would take 2 men to lift, and determined enough to drive us away from its territory. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods now, I catch myself listening for the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. And every time I hear a splash in the water when I'm fishing, there's a moment, just a split second, where my heart stops, and I wonder if whatever was in that cove has found me again. Story 8. I never really talk about this. Most people would think I'm crazy or made it up. But what happened that night in November 2020 still keeps me up sometimes, and I need to get it off my chest. I'm a registered nurse at a hospital in Ellensburg, Kentucky. When COVID hit our area, we were all scared but doing our best. Then in early November, during our routine staff testing, my results came back positive. No symptoms at all, which was a relief, but I still had to isolate. The timing couldn't have been worse. My father-in-law had moved in with us temporarily after his heart surgery. He was 72 with COPD and diabetes, exactly the kind of person who wouldn't survive COVID. My wife Sarah and I have 2 kids, and our house isn't that big. There was no way to properly isolate there without putting him at serious risk. We own this small cabin near Rough River Lake that we use for summer weekends and the occasional hunting trip. It's nothing fancy, just 2 rooms, a bathroom, and a kitchenette. But it's private and peaceful. Sarah suggested I stay there for my quarantine period. It made sense, even though the idea of being alone for 2 weeks wasn't appealing. Sarah packed me a bag with clothes, my laptop, and some books. She also went grocery shopping to get me enough supplies to last the isolation period. We agreed to meet in the Kroger parking lot so she could transfer everything to my truck without getting close to me. When we met up, she was wearing a mask and kept her distance. It felt so strange not being able to hug my own wife. She looked worried, which made me feel guilty, even though catching COVID wasn't my fault. I worked in a hospital, for Christ's sake. "I got you those cheese crackers you like," she said, setting the last bag in my truck bed. "And don't forget to take your vitamins. Call me when you get there." It was around 8:30 when I finally started the drive. The cabin's about 55 miles from Owensboro, mostly through rural areas. November nights get dark early, and this one was especially black. No moon, just a thick blanket of clouds hiding any stars. My headlights carved out a tunnel in the darkness, and as I left the city behind, the streetlights disappeared too. I was on edge already. The COVID diagnosis was stressing me out even without symptoms. Would they develop later? Would I get sick while isolated? What if I needed help? Then there was the guilt about leaving Sarah to deal with the kids and her dad alone. My mind was spinning with all these thoughts as I drove through the night. About halfway to the cabin, I turned onto Route 79, a two-lane road that cuts through some pretty remote areas. The trees crowd right up to the shoulder in spots, creating this tunnel effect. My high beams were on, but they barely seemed to make a dent in the darkness. I had the radio playing low, some late-night talk show discussing the election results, but I wasn't really listening. The road was completely empty. I hadn't seen another car for at least 15 minutes. It was just me, the darkness, and the trees pressing in. That's when I spotted it. Eyeshine off to my right. Growing up in Kentucky, I've seen plenty of deer eyes reflecting in headlights. I immediately took my foot off the gas, slowing down gradually. The last thing I needed was to wreck my truck hitting a deer. As I got closer, I could see it was a decent-sized buck, probably an 8-pointer. It was standing half on the road, half on the shoulder, but something was off. The deer wasn't looking at my truck like they usually do, frozen in the headlights. Instead, its head was turned, staring fixedly at something near the tree line at the end of my headlight's reach. I rolled to almost a complete stop, maybe 5 or 6 miles per hour. The truck's engine idled loudly in the silence. The deer still hadn't moved, completely ignoring the 2-ton vehicle with bright lights just 20 feet away. Whatever had its attention was more concerning than my truck. That's when I saw it. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Just beyond where my headlights were, clearly illuminating the road, there was a dark shape low to the ground. It was moving in this bizarre way that made my skin crawl, kind of crouched and sliding forward. The movement reminded me of how a spider moves, but this was much larger. As I inched forward, my headlights better illuminated the area, and I could see 2 glowing points reflecting back at me. Eyes. But not the bluish-white reflection you get from deer or raccoons. These were a deep, burnt orange color, almost like embers. They were spaced about 6 or 7 inches apart, and each one seemed almost the size of a silver dollar. The deer suddenly tensed, every muscle in its body rigid. I had my window cracked open despite the cold, and I swear I could hear the deer's breathing, quick, shallow pants of fear. It wasn't the headlights scaring it. It was whatever was crouched at the edge of the trees. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind hundreds of times, trying to make sense of it. The deer suddenly bolted, not across the road toward the thing like you'd expect from a panicked animal making a bad decision, but away from it, across the open field on the other side of the road. The moment the deer moved, the crouched shape at the edge of the woods rose up. It unfolded itself in this fluid, completely unnatural movement. 1 second it was low to the ground, the next it was standing upright, tall, really tall. And then it sprinted after the deer. I've seen people run. I've seen dogs and coyotes and wolves on nature shows. Nothing moves like this thing did. It ran on 2 legs, but each stride was like it was somehow compressing and then springing forward. Smooth, but wrong. So wrong. My headlights only caught glimpses as it raced across the field after the deer, but what I could see didn't make sense. It had long, thin limbs and moved with this horrible efficiency. It was gaining on the deer despite the deer running for its life. I sat there, engine idling, completely frozen. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like watching a nature documentary where the predator is chasing down prey, except this predator shouldn't exist. I don't know how long I sat there, probably only seconds, but it felt like minutes. Part of me wanted to just drive away as fast as possible. Another part was morbidly curious about what would happen when that thing caught the deer. But a larger part of me was simply paralyzed with a fear I'd never experienced before. That's when I heard it, a loud snap from the woods on my right, the side where the creature had been. It sounded like a large branch breaking under significant weight. Something else was in there, just out of sight. That sound broke my trance. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal so hard the tires spun before catching. The truck lurched forward, engine roaring as I accelerated away from that spot as fast as possible. As I sped down the road, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep control of the steering wheel. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I was breathing like I'd just run a marathon. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see those orange eyes following me. What scared me most wasn't just the creature itself, but the realization that hit me as I drove away. The deer had been deliberately flushed toward the road, toward an ambush. That thing hadn't just been hunting. It had been working with something else hidden in the forest. They had been hunting together. I made it to the cabin in record time, never dropping below 60 even on the winding rural roads. I nearly crashed into the porch as I pulled up, then fumbled with my keys at the door, constantly looking over my shoulder at the surrounding trees. Once inside, I locked every window and door, then sat in the middle of the main room with all the lights on, my back against the wall where I could see both the front door and the windows. I didn't move for hours. I couldn't even call Sarah because I realized, in my panic, that I'd left my phone charging in the truck. When dawn finally came, I convinced myself I had imagined it all, stress, exhaustion, and the dark playing tricks on my mind. But when I finally worked up the courage to go outside to get my phone, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. About 50 yards from the cabin, at the edge of the clearing where the woods begin, several branches were broken on one of the pine trees, snapped downward as if something heavy had been in the tree. Something that had been watching the cabin all night. I spent my entire quarantine period inside that cabin, windows locked, curtains drawn. I made Sarah bring additional supplies and leave them at the end of the driveway. I told her I wasn't feeling well and didn't want her to come close. It wasn't a complete lie. I was sick with fear. I've never told anyone the full story until now. I've tried researching what I might have seen. The closest I've come is stories about skinwalkers or wendigos from Native American lore. But those are just myths, right? All I know is that whatever I saw that night was hunting, it was intelligent, and it wasn't alone. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear that same snap of a breaking branch outside our bedroom window. And every time I drive that stretch of road now, day or night, I keep my eyes straight ahead and my foot heavy on the gas pedal, because deep down I know those orange eyes are still out there in the dark, watching and waiting. Story 9. I've never really told anyone about this except for close family. Even now, typing this out, my hands are a little shaky. It's been almost 30 years, but I can still see it when I close my eyes. This happened back in November of 1993. I was 32 at the time, pretty experienced in the outdoors. My buddy Jeff and I had been doing our annual hunting trip in the Bitterroot Mountains, in Montana for 6 years straight. We knew the area well, or at least I thought we did. We'd set up our camp in this little valley that had served us well in previous years. It was about 10 miles from the nearest road, properly isolated. We'd arrived 2 days earlier and had already scouted the area for elk. The weather had been pretty calm, cold, but manageable until that morning when we woke up to fresh snow. Not a lot, maybe an inch, but the fog that came with it was something else. It rolled through the pines like something alive, thick enough that visibility dropped to maybe 50 yards at times. By late afternoon, we realized we were running low on firewood. The temperature was supposed to drop pretty hard that night, so Jeff and I headed uphill from camp to gather some more. It was around 5 o'clock, already getting dark because of the season and the weather. We had our headlamps, but we weren't using them yet since there was still enough light to see. We were maybe 200, 300 yards from camp, working our way through a stand of lodgepole pines. The snow made everything quiet in that way that only fresh snow can. I remember the moisture from the fog was collecting on my beard and freezing. I had just bent down to pick up a decent-sized branch when I caught some movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was Jeff moving around, but when I looked up, I saw he was about 20 yards to my right. The movement was coming from straight ahead. That's when I saw it. Look, I've spent my whole life in the outdoors. I've seen bears, moose, elk, mountain lions, all of them up close. What walked across our path that evening wasn't any of those things. It was huge. I mean properly huge. Standing fully upright on two legs, between 7 and 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark hair, not black, more like a deep brown, but it was hard to tell in the fading light. The thing was only about 10 to 15 yards away from me, moving from right to left across the slope. The way it moved is what still haunts me. It wasn't lumbering like a bear on its hind legs. It was fluid, natural, like a person would move, but faster, and with this athletic grace that seemed impossible for something that size. It passed through a denser section of timber, weaving between trees without slowing down, and continued across the slope for 30 or 40 yards before the fog swallowed it. I couldn't move. I literally could not make my body move. I was still half crouched there, holding this stupid branch, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. I don't know how long we stood there in silence. Maybe 30 seconds? A minute? Finally, Jeff whispered, "Did you see that?" I just nodded. My mouth had gone completely dry. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice still barely audible. I shook my head. "I don't know." But I did know. Or at least, I knew what it looked like. I'd just never believed in them before. We didn't say the word, not then. Instead, we gathered our wood as quickly as possible, constantly looking over our shoulders, and practically ran back to camp. We built the fire up bigger than usual that night. Neither of us said much during dinner. I kept replaying the sighting in my head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, I told myself. Bears can stand on their hind legs. But I've seen bears do that, and they don't move like this thing did. Bears don't run on their hind legs for 40 yards with the speed and coordination this thing had. We talked about packing up and leaving the next morning, but there was this unspoken sense of pride that kept us from admitting we were scared. So we decided to stay. We'd just stick closer to camp, we told ourselves. Hunt in pairs. The next day was uneventful. We stayed within sight of camp, taking turns watching the perimeter while the other gathered more wood or cooked. We kept our rifles closer than usual. I'd catch Jeff scanning the tree line, and I know he caught me doing the same. The second day after the sighting, we were feeling a bit braver. We hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, and we still needed to get an elk if this trip wasn't going to be a total waste. So we decided to hunt, but we'd stay relatively close to each other, within shouting distance at least. I headed up the ridge east of camp, while Jeff worked the southern slope. The fog had cleared, but the sky was overcast, making everything look flat and grey. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the snow had this crunchy layer on top that made moving quietly almost impossible. I'd been slowly working my way up the ridge for about 2 hours, maybe a half-mile from camp, when I heard it. A scream. I've spent decades in the wilderness. I've heard elk bugle, cougars scream, the weird bark howl that foxes make. This wasn't any of those. This was something else entirely. It came from the canyon to the north, maybe a mile away. It started high-pitched, almost like a woman screaming, but then it dropped into this guttural roar that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It echoed off the canyon walls, making it sound like it was coming from everywhere at once. Every hair on my body stood up. I'm not exaggerating. It felt like electricity running over my skin. My mouth went dry again, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I raised my rifle instinctively, though whatever made that sound was nowhere near me. The scream lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt much longer. When it stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. I stood there, completely frozen, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't, but somehow that was even more unsettling. I thought about Jeff. He had to have heard it too. We needed to regroup now. I started making my way back toward where I thought he would be, moving faster than was probably wise given the terrain. I kept scanning the trees, looking for any movement. The forest suddenly seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I found Jeff about 20 minutes later. He was already headed back toward camp, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked as soon as he saw me. I nodded. "What the hell was it?" "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out," he said. "Let's get back to camp, pack up and get out of here." This time, I didn't argue. We practically jogged back to camp, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders. The whole time, I had this feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, it was this heavy, oppressive sensation of eyes following my every move. When we got back to camp, we didn't waste any time. We didn't even talk about it. We just started packing up our gear. The tent, the cooking equipment, everything went into our packs in record time. We left the fire pit as it was. Getting out of there seemed more important than proper wilderness etiquette at that point. Just as we were about to leave, Jeff stopped and looked at me. "Connor," he said, his voice low, "look at the ground." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. All around our campsite, just at the edge of the clearing, were footprints in the snow. Huge footprints. They circled the entire perimeter of our camp. They hadn't been there when we left that morning. Whatever made them had been here while we were out hunting. It had walked around our entire campsite, looking at our tent, our gear, our food. The prints were enormous, easily twice the size of my boot, and they clearly showed 5 toes. They weren't bear tracks. Bears have a distinctive pad with 5 toe marks above. These were different. They looked almost human, but no human has feet that size. "It was watching us," Jeff whispered. "Last night while we were sleeping." I couldn't speak. The realization that this thing had been so close, possibly standing just feet from our tent while we slept, made me feel physically ill. We left immediately, moving as quickly as we safely could through the forest. We didn't stop until we reached the truck, and even then, we didn't really breathe easily until we were miles down the road. Jeff and I never went back to that spot. We never really talked about what happened either, not in detail. When people asked about the trip, we just said it was unsuccessful and left it at that. I've thought about it a lot over the years, trying to make sense of what we saw. I've read accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar things. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to call it, I just know what I saw and what I heard. That scream still haunts my dreams sometimes. I'll wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, that high-pitched wail echoing in my head. My wife says I talk in my sleep during these episodes, trying to warn someone to run. I still hunt, still spend time in the wilderness, but I'm more cautious now. I pay attention to that feeling of being watched. I listen more carefully to the sounds of the forest, always alert for anything unusual. Some people won't believe this story, and that's fine. I wouldn't have believed it either if someone had told it to me before that day. But I know what I saw moving through those trees. I know what made those tracks around our camp. And I know what made that scream. The wilderness is vast, and we don't know everything that lives in it. There are places in those mountains where people rarely go, valleys and canyons that might not see human footprints for decades at a time. It's not hard to imagine something living there, something that stays hidden, watching us from the shadows. I don't have proof, no pictures, no plaster casts of the footprints, just my memory and the absolute certainty of what I experienced. That's all I can offer. Take from it what you will. All I know is that I'll never forget that silhouette moving through the fog, or that scream echoing through the canyon. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. They become part of you. Story 10. I've never told this story to people outside my family and community. Even now, at nearly 60 years old, my hands shake when I think about what happened that day in March of 1975. I was 11 then, just a kid who thought she knew everything about the reservation where I grew up. It was March 11th. I remember because it was my aunt's birthday the day before, and we still had leftover cake for breakfast. Me and my cousin Lily were staying at my aunt's house on the Onondaga reservation in New York. We were supposed to go back to my house that morning. Mom was expecting us by lunchtime, and it wasn't that far, maybe a 45-minute walk. We left around 11 in the morning. I remember my aunt standing on the porch, telling us to be careful and stay on the main road. But we were 11, and the main road was boring. Plus, we'd heard about some teenagers who would sometimes hang around there and bother kids who walked by. So once we were out of sight of my aunt's house, I turned to Lily. "Let's cut through the woods," I said. "It'll be faster anyway." Lily hesitated. She was always more cautious than me. "Are you sure, Cheryl?" she asked. "Your mum told us to stay on the road." "The woods are safer," I insisted. "No cars, no teenagers. We know these trails." So we turned onto the path that cut through the woods. It was cold that day, not freezing, but definitely still winter. The kind of cold that makes your nose run and your fingers go numb if you take off your gloves. There was no snow on the ground anymore, but everything was brown and grey, the trees still bare. We'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes when I first got that feeling. You know the one, like you're being watched. I didn't say anything to Lily at first. I thought I was just being silly. But then I noticed she kept looking over her shoulder too. "Do you feel that?" She finally whispered. I nodded. "Like someone's watching us." "Yeah." We stopped and looked around. The woods were quiet, too quiet now that I think about it. No birds, no squirrels rushing around, just the sound of the wind through the bare branches. "It's nothing," I said, trying to sound brave. "Probably just a deer or something." We kept walking, but faster now. The gravel pits were coming up, a big open area where people used to dig gravel. It was the halfway point to my house. Once we crossed that, we'd be on the home stretch. The pits were pretty deep, maybe 20 feet down with steep sides. There was a path down one side that wasn't too steep, and that's the way we always went. I went down first, sliding part of the way on my butt because the dirt was loose. Lily followed me. At the bottom, I noticed a frozen mud puddle and couldn't resist stomping on it to break the ice. Just kid stuff, you know. Meanwhile, Lily realized she'd dropped one of her gloves on the way down. "I'm going back up to get it," she said, and started climbing back up the embankment. I kept playing with the ice, stomping and watching it crack. I wasn't paying attention to Lily until I heard her voice. "Cheryl!" she called, her voice strange and tight. I ignored her at first, too busy with my puddle. "Cheryl!" she called again, louder this time. Something in her voice made me look up. She was standing at the top of the embankment, completely still. "Cheryl!" This time she screamed my name. I scrambled up the slope, dirt and rocks sliding under my feet. When I reached her, she grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What? What is it?" I asked. She didn't speak. She just pointed to a cluster of trees about 50 feet away. At first I didn't see anything. Then I did, and my whole body went cold. There was an arm, a massive hairy arm, reaching around one of the trees. Not a human arm. It was huge, covered in dark brown hair, with a hand bigger than my head. As we watched, frozen in place, the arm slowly withdrew behind the tree. My first thought was that it was a hunter in a fur coat, but no hunter would be hiding like that, watching two little girls. My next thought was that it was some pervert, some sicko stalking us, but that arm, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. "Run," Lily whispered. "Now!" We bolted. We ran straight across the gravel pit, heading for the road on the other side. My lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, but terror kept me going. We scrambled up the other side of the pit, grabbing at roots and rocks to pull ourselves up. Just as we reached the top, I looked back over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. It was moving through a stand of sumac trees on the far side of the pit, trees that stood 6 to 8 feet tall. But this This thing was taller. Its head and shoulders rose above the treetops. It was massive, broader than any man I'd ever seen, covered in dark hair, moving with a strange rolling gait that was somehow both awkward and powerful. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The creature was on the opposite side of the pit from where we'd seen the arm, a distance of at least 150 feet, but it had somehow crossed that space in seconds without making a sound. It was impossible. "Come on!" Lily screamed, grabbing my arm again. We ran the rest of the way to the road and didn't stop running until we reached my house. We burst through the door, gasping for breath, tears streaming down our faces. "What happened?" my mum demanded, rushing to us. "Are you hurt?" "We saw it," I gasped. "We saw Sasquatch." I'll never forget the look on my mom's face, concern mixed with disbelief, then relief as she realized we weren't hurt, just scared. "Girls, there's no such thing as Sasquatch," she said gently. "We saw it," Lily insisted. "It was huge, taller than the trees." My uncle, who was visiting that day, laughed. "Sounds like you two have quite an imagination." Nobody believed us. They thought we'd scared ourselves with stories, or maybe seen a bear, though bears weren't common in our area. The adults exchanged knowing looks over our heads. Poor girls, they seemed to say. Got themselves all worked up over nothing. But Lily and I knew what we'd seen. We talked about it that night, whispering in the bedroom we shared at my house. "Why won't they believe us?" Lily asked. "I don't know," I said. "But we know what we saw." We went over every detail, comparing our memories. Our stories matched perfectly. The hairy arm, the massive figure moving through the trees, how it had somehow crossed the entire pit in seconds without us seeing or hearing it move. We swore to each other that we'd never change our story, no matter how much the adults laughed at us. Over the years, as we grew up and kept telling the same story with the same details, our families gradually stopped laughing. They started to listen. Maybe they never fully believed us, but they could see that we believed it, that the experience had marked us both deeply. I started having dreams about the creature a few years after the incident. Not nightmares exactly, though they were frightening. In these dreams, the creature, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, would return with others of its kind. They would make these calls, these sounds that would fill me with both terror and a strange sense of recognition. In the dreams, the creatures would lead our people, not just my family, but all the Onondaga, to the underground caves that are sacred to our tribe. There are legends about these caves, stories that say they connect all the Indian reservations through underground passages. In my dreams, the world above ground was destroyed by war, by pollution, by some unnamed catastrophe. But underground, guided by these creatures, we survived until the earth healed itself. Then we would emerge to begin life anew. I didn't tell anyone about these dreams at first. They seemed too strange, too personal. But one night at a family gathering when I was in my 20s, the story of our childhood encounter came up again. This time, my grandmother was there. She'd been away when it first happened, visiting relatives on another reservation. "Where exactly did you see this creature?" she asked, her weathered face serious. We described the location, the gravel pits, the stand of trees. She nodded slowly. "That's near the entrance to the old cave." "What cave?" I asked. "The one in the old stories," she said, "the one that goes deep into the earth. Our people have known about it for generations." That's when I finally told someone about my dreams. My grandmother listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, she took my hand. "In the old days," she said, "our people believed that Bigfoot was not just an animal. It was a spirit being, a guardian of the indigenous peoples. Some said it could move between worlds, our world and the spirit world." After that conversation, I started to think about our encounter differently. I was still terrified by the memory. I wouldn't go near those woods alone, even as an adult. But I also began to wonder if there was some purpose to what we'd seen, some message in the creature's appearance and in my recurring dreams. I'm 59 now. I've had a good life, raised children of my own, told them the stories of our people, including my own encounter all those years ago. Sometimes I wonder if my children believe me any more than the adults believed Lily and me back then. But I know what I saw, and lately, my dreams have been coming more frequently. I see the creatures leading us underground as the world above falls apart. I see us emerging years later into a new world, purified and renewed. These dreams feel urgent now, like a warning. I still don't know exactly what Lily and I saw that day in 1975. Was it just a flesh and blood creature, some unknown species living secretly in the woods? Or was it something more, a spirit guardian, a messenger from another realm? All I know for certain is that it was real, it was massive, and seeing it changed something in me forever. Sometimes I find myself looking at the news, climate change, wars, pollution, and I wonder if my dreams are just dreams, or if they're preparing me for something real. I wonder if someday I'll hear that call from the woods, and I'll know it's time to gather my family and follow the creatures to safety underground. I still get chills thinking about that massive arm reaching around the tree, about that huge figure moving silently through the sumac. But these days, the fear is mixed with something else. A strange sense of anticipation, as if I'm waiting for something I don't fully understand. Maybe someday I'll know for sure. Until then, I carry this story with me. The day two little girls saw something impossible in the woods, something that might have been watching over them all along. Story 11. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened last summer. It's been 8 months and I haven't gone camping since. My therapist suggested I write this down as a way to process it, but honestly, I don't think anything will help me make sense of what happened that night at Lake of the Woods. My friends Tara, Michelle, and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We're all in our mid-20s and have been friends since high school. We wanted to get away from the city, disconnect from everything, and just enjoy nature for a weekend. Lake of the Woods Provincial Park seemed perfect. It spans the border between Manitoba and Ontario, and we found this really secluded campsite that was supposed to be beautiful. We arrived on Friday afternoon after a long drive. The ranger at the entrance seemed surprised to see us. "You girls are the only ones at Campground C this weekend," he told us. "Most folks don't come out this far in late September." That should have been our first warning sign, but we were excited about having the place to ourselves. The campsite was gorgeous, right near the lake with tall pines surrounding it. We set up our tent, a big 4-person one that we've used on trips before. We spent the afternoon hiking, collecting firewood and taking pictures of the lake. The sunset that evening was incredible, all orange and purple reflecting off the water. We sat around the campfire for hours, drinking a few beers, roasting marshmallows and catching up on life. I remember feeling so happy and peaceful. The stars were amazing that night. You could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky. Around 11, we decided to call it a night. We put out the fire properly. I'm always paranoid about forest fires. Used the outhouse that was about 50 yards from our site and crawled into our sleeping bags. I fell asleep almost immediately. I've always been a heavy sleeper. My roommates joke that I could sleep through an earthquake. Tara and Michelle were on either side of me in the tent, and I remember feeling warm and comfortable as I drifted off. What happened next, I only know from what Tara and Michelle told me because I slept through most of it. They both told me the same story independently the next day, which makes it all the more terrifying. Around 1 in the morning, Tara woke up to a sound she couldn't immediately identify. It was a sort of low, guttural howl, not quite like a wolf, but definitely animal. She lay there for a few minutes listening, wondering if she'd dreamed it. Then she heard it again, closer this time, and she reached over to wake Michelle. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Michelle was already awake, her eyes wide in the darkness. "What is that?" Michelle whispered back. "It doesn't sound like a wolf." They described the sound as a cross between a howl and a grunt, with this weird cadence to it, almost like it had a pattern. They said it didn't sound like any animal they'd ever heard before, and it was getting closer. I was still sound asleep between them, completely oblivious. They tried to wake me, shaking my shoulder gently at first, then more forcefully, but I didn't even stir. I've always been a heavy sleeper, but this was extreme even for me. The howling stopped suddenly, and for a moment they thought whatever it was had moved on. Then they heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our tent. They weren't the light, scampering steps of a raccoon, or even the heavier tread of a deer. These were slow, methodical steps that seemed to be making a deliberate circuit around our tent. Michelle grabbed her phone to use as a flashlight, but the battery was nearly dead. She turned it on just long enough to check the time, 1:33 in the morning, before saving what power she had left in case they needed to call for help. Tara's phone was in her backpack at the foot of the tent, and she was too terrified to move to get it. The footsteps continued circling, occasionally pausing at different points around the tent. Then the howling started again, but this time it was right outside the tent wall. Tara said it was so loud that the tent fabric vibrated with the sound. They couldn't understand why I wasn't waking up. What happened next is what truly terrifies me. The thing, whatever it was, began pressing against the side of the tent where I was sleeping. Tara and Michelle could see the fabric pushing inward, creating an indentation that moved along my sleeping form. They said it was like whatever was out there knew exactly where I was, even though there's no way it could see through the tent. The pressure increased until it was actually pushing against my body through the tent wall. Tara and Michelle watched in horror as the force actually rolled me over in my sleeping bag, and I still didn't wake up. They said I mumbled something in my sleep and then settled back down, completely unaware. Both of them were frozen in terror. Michelle wanted to scream, to make noise, to scare the thing away, but she was afraid of provoking it. Tara thought about reaching for the small canister of bear spray in her pack, but couldn't bring herself to move. So they just stayed absolutely still, pressing themselves against the opposite wall of the tent, as far from the sounds as they could get. For the next hour or so, the thing continued circling the tent. Sometimes it would make that howling, grunting sound. Sometimes it would go quiet, except for those deliberate footsteps. Occasionally, they heard what sounded like sniffing, as if it was trying to catch our scent. Then it started dropping things onto the roof of our tent. At first, they thought it might be tree branches falling, but the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. Whatever it was would drop something, wait, then drop another. They could hear the objects rolling down the sloped sides of the tent. Around 3 in the morning, the sounds finally started to move away from our campsite. The howling grew more distant, though they could still hear it echoing through the trees. Tara and Michelle remained wide awake, too terrified to sleep, listening intently for any sign that it was coming back. At about 4 in the morning, I finally woke up. I needed to pee, and as I started to sit up, I heard it. A distant, eerie, howling sound coming from deep in the forest. I immediately noticed that Tara and Michelle were both wide awake, pressed against the far side of the tent, staring at me with these horrified expressions. "Do you guys hear that?" I whispered. Tara burst into tears. "It's been out there for hours," she said, her voice shaking. "It was right outside the tent. It was touching you through the tent, Jess. It rolled you over." I thought they were joking at first, or that they'd had some shared nightmare, but they were both so genuinely terrified, and their stories matched up exactly. I'd never seen either of them so scared. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the center of the tent, waiting for dawn. None of us suggested going outside to investigate, not even to make the 50-yard trek to the outhouse. I had to pee in an empty water bottle because there was no way any of us were leaving that tent before daylight. When the sun finally came up around 6:30, We cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. The campsite looked normal at first glance. Our picnic table was undisturbed, our cooler was where we'd left it. But then we noticed the pine cones. There were dozens of them scattered all around our tent, more than had been there the day before. And they weren't just randomly distributed, they seemed to form a rough circle around where we'd slept. These were what had been dropped on our tent during the night. We also found footprints in the soft earth around our tent. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Too large for a wolf or coyote, but not shaped like a bear print either. They had this weird, elongated shape, almost human-like, but not quite. They formed a perfect circle around our tent, just as Tara and Michelle had described. We packed up in record time, not even bothering to make breakfast. We just threw everything into the car, barely taking time to collapse the tent properly. As we were loading the last of our gear, the ranger from the day before drove up on his ATV. "Heading out early?" he asked, seeming surprised to see us packing. I hesitated, then decided to ask, "Did you hear any strange noises last night? Like howling?" His expression changed subtly. "What kind of howling?" Michelle tried to imitate the sound she'd heard, and the ranger's face went completely blank. "You girls should finish packing up," he said after a moment. "Not good to be out in these woods after dark." "Do you know what made that sound?" Tara pressed him. He glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "Local tribes have stories," he said quietly, "about something that lives in these woods, something that's drawn to women, especially when they're sleeping. They say it's curious, that it likes to examine people while they sleep." He shrugged. "Just old stories, probably. But I don't camp out in this section anymore." He drove off before we could ask any more questions. We finished packing in silence and got the hell out of there. During the drive home, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear or some other animal we just weren't familiar with. But none of the explanations felt right. I've looked up every animal native to the Lake of the Woods region, and nothing matches what Tara and Michelle described. I've researched local legends and found vague references to forest spirits that are attracted to dreamers, but nothing specific. The part that still haunts me is that whatever it was seemed specifically interested in me, the one who was deeply asleep. Why couldn't Tara and Michelle wake me? Why did it focus on me? And what would have happened if they hadn't been there? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that something intelligent was stalking our tent that night, something that knew we were there, something that could move a sleeping person through the wall of a tent. And it's probably still out there in those woods, waiting for the next group of campers who don't know better than to stay away. Story 12. I've carried this memory for 20 years, and it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I've never really told the full story to anyone outside my family because, well, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened when I was 12, during our annual family camping trip to Huntsville State Park in East Texas. We'd been going there every summer since I was little. Fishing, swimming, hiking, the usual stuff. It was like a second home to me. I knew every trail, every good fishing spot, or at least I thought I did. That day started like any other. The sun was beating down, typical Texas summer, probably around 95 degrees. My nephew Jake, he was 10 at the time. Yeah, I know it's weird having a nephew younger than you, but my oldest sister had him when she was really young. Came running up to our campsite all excited. "Emily! Emily!" he shouted, practically bouncing. "I found this awesome fishing spot yesterday when I was exploring with Dad. You gotta come see it." I was bored, and fishing sounded better than sitting around while the adults drank beer and told the same old stories. My mum barely looked up from her magazine when I asked if we could take the rowboat out. "Just wear your life jackets and be back before dark," she said. We grabbed our fishing poles, a small tackle box, and those awful orange life jackets that smell like mildew and lake water. Jake was practically skipping, as we headed down to the dock. "Where exactly is this place?" I asked as we untied the boat. "Across the lake." Jake pointed vaguely to the opposite shore. "There's this little cove you can't see from here. Dad and I caught like 20 fish there yesterday." I remember rolling my eyes because Jake always exaggerated. 20 fish probably meant 3 or 4, but whatever. I was up for an adventure. The lake was calm that day, barely a ripple on the surface. The rowboat made that creaking sound with every stroke of the oars. It was peaceful, and I remember feeling so grown up, taking my younger nephew out without adults. We must have rowed for about 20 minutes before Jake started pointing excitedly. "There! See that little opening in the trees? That's where we need to go." I turned to look where he was pointing. It wasn't a cove exactly, more like a narrow inlet where the water cut into the shoreline, surrounded by dense pine trees. Something about it made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was too shadowy, or maybe it was just unfamiliar. "You sure that's the spot?" I asked, hesitating. "Positive. Come on, it's the best fishing ever." Jake was practically hanging over the side of the boat in his excitement. As we got closer, Jake kept chattering about the secret trail beyond the inlet. "Once you go in, there's no turning back," he said with this weird little smile. "It's like a one-way journey." "What does that even mean?" I asked, getting annoyed. "You'll see. Dad said it's because the trail only goes one way through the forest, and then you have to take the long way back around." That made more sense, but something still felt off. The inlet was narrow, with trees hanging low over the water, casting everything in shadow. The temperature seemed to drop as we entered it, and the sounds of the main lake, distant boats, people laughing, even the wind, all seemed to fade away. We finally reached a small, muddy bank where Jake insisted we should dock. "We can tie the boat to that tree," he said, pointing to a gnarled pine near the water's edge. I secured the boat while Jake gathered his fishing gear, babbling about all the fish we were going to catch. The muddy shore gave way to a barely visible path leading into the woods. It wasn't an official park trail. No markers, no cleared path, just a slight depression in the ground where people had walked before. "How far is this fishing spot?" I asked, suddenly not wanting to go too deep into these unfamiliar woods. "Not far, like 5 minutes." Jake was already marching ahead. I remember standing there for a moment, looking around. The forest felt different here, darker, more closed in. The pines were so dense that little sunlight filtered through. There was this smell too, kind of musty and sour. Not like the fresh pine scent in the rest of the park. That's when it happened. I was just about to follow Jake when the entire forest erupted into chaos. Every bird in what felt like a mile radius suddenly took flight at once. The sound was deafening, wings flapping, birds screeching. It was like something from a horror movie. The sky above the trees darkened with them. "What the?" I started to say, when a movement caught my eye. I turned back toward the shoreline, and that's when I saw it, just at the edge of my vision, moving between the trees about 50 yards away. I still struggled to describe what I saw. It was tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, maybe 7 feet or more. It was covered in dark fur, almost black, but with these patches of deep brown. Its hair was long and matted, especially around its head and shoulders. But what I remember most clearly, what still haunts me when I close my eyes, was the way it moved. It ran with these long, fluid strides, almost graceful despite its size, not lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that big to move. And it was fast, so incredibly fast. But the worst part, the part that made my blood freeze in my veins, was when it turned and looked in our direction, just for a split second. Its eyes, they weren't angry or predatory. They were filled with absolute terror, like it was running from something worse than itself, something that might be coming our way. In that moment, I completely lost it. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the muddy shore. I started screaming and crying all at once, my whole body shaking so bad I couldn't even point to show Jake what I'd seen. "What? What is it?" Jake came running back, looking confused and a little scared by my reaction. "We need to go, now!" I managed to choke out between sobs. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely untie the boat. "There's something in the woods! It's big and it's watching us!" Jake's eyes went wide, but then, to my horror, he started laughing. "Did you see a bear? Dad said there might be bears." "It wasn't a bear," I screamed, finally getting the rope free. It was like a person, but not. It was huge and covered in fur, and it was running so fast. I practically threw Jake into the boat and started rowing with everything I had. My arms burned, and I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified that thing would come bursting out of the trees after us. That's when Jake said something that still makes my skin crawl. "I see more of them," he whispered, staring into the water. "What?" I whipped my head around, nearly dropping an oar. Jake was leaning over the side of the boat, pointing into the dark water. "There, see? There's like 3 or 4 of them swimming under us." I couldn't see anything in the murky lake water, just my own terrified reflection. To this day, I don't know if Jake really saw something or if he was just trying to scare me even more, but the pure panic I felt in that moment was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I rowed so hard that blisters formed on my palms, and I didn't even notice until hours later. We shot out of that inlet like we were being chased by the devil himself. I didn't stop rowing until we were halfway across the open lake, and only then did I let myself breathe. Jake kept pestering me with questions. "What did you really see? Was it Bigfoot? Was it a monster? Why are you so scared?" I couldn't answer. My teeth were chattering despite the summer heat, and I kept scanning the distant shoreline, terrified I'd see that thing again, watching us from between the trees. When we finally reached the main shore, I realized in my panic I'd rowed to the wrong dock. We were at someone else's campsite. An older couple looked at us strangely as we approached, probably because I was still crying and looked like I'd seen a ghost. "Sorry," I managed to stammer. "Wrong campsite." This meant we had to row along the shoreline to get back to our family's site, and that meant facing the direction of that inlet again. I remember the absolute dread washing over me, the way my stomach clenched and my vision narrowed as we turned the boat. "I don't want to go back," I kept repeating, barely aware I was saying it out loud. "I don't want to go back." Jake finally seemed to realize how genuinely terrified I was. He offered to row, but his arms were too short to do it effectively, so I forced myself to keep going, even as tears streamed down my face. When we finally reached our campsite, my mom took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but it came out as a jumbled mess between sobs. My dad assumed I'd just gotten spooked by a deer or maybe a wild hog. Jake, thankfully, backed up my story about seeing something big, though he admitted he hadn't seen it himself. No one believed me, not really. They humored me, checked the boat for any signs of what I'd seen, there weren't any, and eventually chalked it up to an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw, 20 years later, and I can still see those eyes in my dreams. The irony is that I still live in East Texas, in a little house surrounded by pine woods, not unlike those at Huntsville State Park. My husband works nights a lot, leaving me alone in the house. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees just right, I hear sounds that make me freeze. And sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, I think I see something moving between the trunks. I've learned to live with the fear, but I've never gone back to that part of the lake, and I never will. Story 13. I never thought I'd share this, but I need to get it off my chest. What I'm about to tell you happened when I was 11 years old, back in 1996, but it feels like yesterday. Growing up in Ritchie County, West Virginia meant being surrounded by endless hills, thick forests, and hollows so deep they seemed bottomless. Our house sat on a small clearing halfway up one of those hills, with woods closing in on three sides and a gravel road leading down to the main. Anyway, that spring afternoon started like any other. Mum was inside making dinner, Dad was still at work at the lumber yard, and my older sister was on the phone with her boyfriend. I was bored, so I went out back to mess around with our burn barrel, where we'd dispose of trash that couldn't be salvaged or reused. We weren't well off, and in those hills you learned to make do with what you had. The air was cool but warming up, with that earthy smell that comes after rain. I remember kicking at the gravel around the burn barrel, thinking about asking Dad if we could go fishing that weekend. Something made me look up toward the tree line that bordered our property. Maybe a bird call, or just that feeling you get when you're being watched. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought someone was standing at the edge of our yard. Then I realized it was too big to be a person. It stood next to our second burn barrel, the one we rarely used, about 50 yards from where I was. It was dark, not black, but a deep brown like wet tree bark, and covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but coarser, almost shaggy in places, especially around the shoulders. The thing was tall, maybe 7 feet, but not as gigantic as you hear in some stories. What made it terrifying wasn't just its height, but how solid it was. Its chest and shoulders were massive like a weightlifter's, but more natural, like something that got strong from living wild, not from a gym. The arms hung lower than a person's would, with hands, yes, hands, not paws, that seemed huge even from where I stood. But it was the smell that hit me next. Even from that distance, a powerful musky odor rolled across the yard. It's hard to describe exactly, like something rotten but not dead rotten. More like sour sweat, wet animal, and something else I couldn't place. The smell was so strong it seemed to stick to the inside of my nose and throat. I couldn't move. I just stood there, 1 foot on the edge of our burn barrel, frozen like a statue. The creature didn't move either, it just watched me. I couldn't make out its face clearly. It was shadowed under a heavy brow, but I could feel its eyes on me. Not like an animal sizing up prey, but like something thinking, considering what I was. We must have stared at each other for 20, maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. I kept waiting for it to charge at me or run away, but it did neither. It just stood there, as if it had every right to be there, like I was the intruder on its land. Then my sister yelled from the porch, asking if I wanted a soda. The creature's head turned slightly toward the sound, and in that instant, I saw its profile more clearly, a flat nose, a heavy jaw. Not human, but not fully animal either. Before I could answer my sister, the thing simply turned and walked into the trees. It didn't run or crash through the underbrush. It walked, purposefully and quietly, vanishing into the shadows of the forest that led down into the hollow beyond our property. When it was gone, my legs nearly gave out. I ran back to the house, but stopped at the porch steps. I didn't tell my sister or my mom. Even at 11, I knew what people would say, that I was making it up or had seen a bear. But I knew what bears looked like. We saw them often enough. This wasn't a bear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to look out my window toward the tree line, half expecting to see the creature standing there watching our house. The wind picked up after midnight, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I swear I could still smell that musky odor, like it had followed me or clung to my clothes. I didn't tell anyone for days, but I started noticing things I hadn't before. How the dogs in our area would sometimes bark at nothing in the middle of the night, all at once, like they were sounding an alarm. How sometimes the birds would go quiet when we walked certain parts of our property. And most of all, I noticed the hollow that stretched beyond our yard and down into the valley. We called it Sawyer's Hollow after the old sawmill that had operated there decades ago. All that remained was a rusted-out shed and some equipment too heavy to haul away. It was a place we went sometimes with Dad to cut firewood for winter. It was also a place that always made me uneasy, even before I saw the creature. About a week after my encounter, Dad announced we needed to stock up on firewood. Even though it was spring, he liked to get ahead on the winter preparations. My stomach knotted up when he said we'd be going down to the old sawmill site. "Can't we cut wood somewhere else?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Dad looked at me funny. "Sawyer's got the best hardwood around. White oak burns longest." I couldn't argue with that, so the next morning we loaded up in Dad's pickup, Mom, Dad, my sister and me. As we drove down the rutted path toward the hollow, I pressed myself against the door, eyes scanning the trees. The old sawmill site was in a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees. As soon as we stepped out of the truck, I felt it, that sense of being watched. Dad started up the chainsaw, and the noise echoed through the trees, seeming to bounce back at us from all directions. But even over the roar of the chainsaw, there was a stillness, a tension in the air that made the hair on my arms stand up. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Mom kept looking over her shoulder as she helped stack the cut logs. My sister stayed unusually close to Dad, and Dad himself worked faster than usual, not stopping for his normal cigarette breaks. After about an hour, Mum suddenly straightened up and said, "Let's finish this another day." Dad didn't even argue, which was strange for him. He just nodded, shut off the chainsaw, and we loaded up what wood we'd cut. As we were getting in the truck, Mom looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Start the truck and don't stop till we get to the top of the ridge." Dad did exactly that. We drove up that hill faster than was safe on those roads, the truck bouncing and sliding on loose gravel. No one spoke until we reached the top of the ridge, where Dad finally slowed down. "Something ain't right down there," he muttered, mostly to himself. I almost told them then about what I'd seen by the burn barrel, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I asked, "Do you think there's bears?" Mom and Dad exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "Maybe," Dad said, but his tone said he didn't believe it was bears any more than I did. We didn't go back to the sawmill for weeks. When winter came early that year, with a heavy snow in late October, we finally had to return for more firewood. The hollow looked different under a blanket of snow, quieter, but somehow more watchful. That day, we found the tracks. They crossed the path about 20 yards from the sawmill shed, huge impressions in the fresh snow, leading from one side of the clearing to the other. Dad stopped the truck, and we all got out to look. They were footprints, unmistakably, but not human, at least not any human I'd ever seen. They were 17 to 20 inches long, very wide at the heel, with visible toe impressions. They weren't boots or shoes. They were bare feet, and whatever made them was heavy enough to compact the snow solidly. Dad took off his glove and reached down to touch one of the prints. He didn't say anything, but his face went pale. We loaded up and left without cutting any wood that day. After that, no one mentioned the tracks again, at least not to me. But I noticed Dad installed stronger locks on our doors that week, and Mum started keeping the dogs inside at night instead of in their pen. I kept watching the tree line, especially near dusk. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, a shadow darker than the others, but it never came as close as it had that first day. Still, I knew it was out there. I could feel it. When spring came around again, I started exploring more, always, careful to stay within shouting distance of the house. I found things in the woods I couldn't explain, broken branches too high up for a person to reach, strange arrangements of stones that didn't seem natural, and once a deer carcass that had been torn apart but not eaten like a predator would. The years passed and I grew up. Eventually I went off to college, then got a job in Charleston. I only visit my parents' place a few times a year now, but every time I go back, I feel it again. That sense of being watched from the hollow. The land there hasn't changed much. Ritchie County is still mostly wilderness, thousands of acres of forest where people rarely go. It's the kind of land that swallows up noise and light, where old things could remain unseen if they wanted to. There's enough space there for something to stay hidden, to live a life parallel to ours without crossing paths except by accident or choice. I've never told this story publicly before. For years I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that a child's mind had transformed a bear or a deer into something more mysterious. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. And I know those tracks in the snow weren't made by anything commonly known to live in those hills. Last Christmas, I drove up to my parents' place through a snowstorm. When I arrived, Dad was on the porch, shotgun resting against the railing. I asked him what he was watching for, and he just nodded toward the tree line and said, "Just keeping an eye out." That night, after Mom and Dad had gone to bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped, and the moon cast blue shadows across the yard. That same musky odor hit me suddenly, so familiar after all these years. I looked toward our old burn barrel and saw nothing, but as I turned to go back inside, I caught movement at the edge of my vision. Standing at the tree line, half hidden by an old oak, was a dark figure, taller and broader than any man. It raised a hand, not waving, not threatening, just acknowledging. Then it was gone, vanishing into the hollow that had been its home long before it had been ours. Story 14. I still can't explain what happened that weekend in '85. I've spent nearly 40 years trying to rationalize it, but I can't. I was 16 then, and my buddies Kevin and Andrew were 17. We were just normal high school kids looking for a weekend away from our parents. Kevin's family had this cabin northeast of Ellensburg, Washington. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place with wood paneling everywhere and furniture from the '70s. But it was perfect for us. His parents let us go up there alone sometimes, probably thinking the worst we'd do was sneak some beers. If they'd known what actually happened, they never would have let us go back. It was mid-October, peak fall. The leaves were changing, and there was that crisp smell in the air. We arrived Friday after school, spent the day Saturday hiking and messing around. Nothing unusual. The cabin sat at the end of this long gravel driveway, maybe a quarter-mile, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. Beyond that were hills and more wilderness. The nearest neighbor was at least half a mile away. Saturday night, we made hot dogs for dinner and were getting bored. It was around 8 o'clock when Kevin suggested we take a walk. The moon was full, I remember, because it was bright enough that we didn't even need flashlights. There was something peaceful about it, walking down that gravel driveway to the paved road that cut through the woods. We'd been walking maybe 10 minutes when I first heard it. Movement in the brush about 20 yards off the roadside. Not like a squirrel or something small. This was heavy, deliberate. "You guys hear that?" I asked, stopping. Kevin nodded, looking toward the sound. Probably a deer, or maybe a bear. "Bear!" Andrew's voice went up an octave. He was always the nervous one. "If it is, we should make noise," Kevin said. "Hey, go away!" he yelled toward the woods. We all started shouting, half scared, half laughing at ourselves. The rustling stopped for a moment, but I swear I could feel something watching us. That's when the smell hit me. I've worked in a butcher shop since college, and I know the smell of rotting meat. This was like that, but worse, mixed with something sulfuric and musty, like wet animal fur that never dried properly. It was so strong I actually gagged. "Jesus, what is that?" Andrew covered his nose with his shirt. "Bigfoot," Kevin joked, making spooky gestures with his hands. "The legendary Sasquatch." We laughed, but nervously. The Pacific Northwest and Bigfoot stories go hand in hand, but none of us actually believed in that stuff. We were science-minded kids who watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos and thought we knew everything. We kept walking, and I tried to ignore the crawling sensation on the back of my neck. The feeling that eyes were on us never went away. Every few minutes we'd hear something. Branches breaking deeper in the woods, always parallel to us, never falling behind. At one point, we passed a small pond off to the right of the road. As we walked by, there was a loud splash, like something big had jumped in or moved through the water. We all froze, staring at the ripples in the moonlight. "Beaver?" Andrew suggested weakly. Kevin shook his head. "Too big for a beaver." I don't know how to explain what happened next. It was like a wave of dread washed over all three of us simultaneously. The joking stopped. The night suddenly felt colder. The moonlight that had seemed friendly now cast strange, reaching shadows from the trees. "Let's head back," I said, and nobody argued. We'd walked maybe a mile from the cabin, not far at all. But walking back felt different. The sounds in the woods became more frequent. The smell would come and go in waves, sometimes so strong I had to breathe through my mouth. We were almost to the gravel driveway when it happened. The trees to our right, about 30 feet from the road, began shaking violently. Not like wind, there wasn't any, but like something powerful was moving through them, thrashing against branches. We didn't even look at each other. Pure instinct took over, and we sprinted down that driveway toward the cabin. I remember the sound of gravel crunching under our sneakers, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The worst part was not looking back, not knowing if something was chasing us. We burst through the cabin door, slammed it shut, and locked it. We were all breathing hard, looking at each other wide-eyed. "What the fuck was that?" Andrew gasped. "Probably a moose or something," Kevin said, but his voice was shaking. He didn't believe it any more than we did. We double-checked all the doors and windows, turned on every light in the cabin, and tried to calm down. We ended up watching a movie on the small TV, volume up loud to drown out any sounds from outside. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off, and exhaustion set in. By midnight, we were all crashed out in the second bedroom. 3 teenage boys crammed into 2 twin beds, pushed together, none of us wanting to sleep alone. I fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. My watch said around 1 in the morning. What I do know is that all 3 of us woke at exactly the same moment. No noise had disturbed us. It was something else, something I still can't explain. Andrew was in the bed nearest the window. The cabin was built on a slight slope, so that particular window was about 12 feet off the ground on the outside. I'll never forget the look on Andrew's face as he stared at that window, his skin gone pale in the moonlight filtering through. I followed his gaze and felt my entire body go cold. There was a face looking in at us, not a human face. The head was massive, with a strange conical shape at the top. It had short hair or fur covering it. The shoulders were enormous, taking up most of the window frame. But the eyes, Jesus, the eyes, they were glowing a reddish orange, and they were forward-facing like a primate's, not set on the sides like a deer or normal wildlife. Those eyes were intelligent. That's what haunts me the most. There was something looking at us that understood what it was seeing. Andrew let out a strangled sound and jumped out of bed. "Close the shade," Kevin hissed. "Close the fucking shade." Andrew lunged for the pull cord, and as he moved, the face dropped from view. Not like it ducked down, more like it simply lowered itself from its position. Whatever it was had to be incredibly strong to hold itself up to a window 12 feet off the ground. None of us slept after that. We sat in the living room with all the lights on, a kitchen knife in Kevin's hand, talking in whispers. We heard movement outside several times, heavy footsteps on the wooden deck, something brushing against the cabin walls. The smell seeped in through the cracks around the windows, that same rotting sulfuric odor. When dawn finally came, we were still sitting there, exhausted and terrified. Kevin's dog, Rusty, who'd slept through the entire night in the main bedroom, now refused to go outside to do his business. He stayed close to the cabin all day, growling at the tree line. We packed up and left by 9 that morning, making excuses to Kevin's parents about homework we'd forgotten. I don't think any of us wanted to admit we were too scared to stay another night. Later that day, safely back in town, we tried to make sense of what happened. Kevin suggested a bear, but bears can't lift themselves 12 feet up to peer in windows, and their eyes don't glow orange-red. Andrew thought maybe it was local kids playing a prank, but how would they know we were there? And what teenager is 7+ feet tall with shoulders that wide? I didn't offer any theories. I couldn't then, and I still can't now. We made a pact not to tell anyone. Who would believe us anyway? 3 teenagers see monster in woods sounds like the beginning of a bad horror movie, but I know what I saw. I know that smell. I remember those eyes looking at us with an intelligence that wasn't animal, wasn't quite human either. Kevin's family sold the cabin 3 years later. I never went back. I've since read about other sightings in the Cascades. Hikers finding strange footprints, campers hearing unusual vocalizations at night. People call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, giving it a name to make it less frightening. But names don't change what I experienced. Something was in those woods that night. Something that could silently track 3 boys for over a mile. Something strong enough to shake mature trees and hoist itself up to a 2nd-story window. Something with glowing eyes that watched us while we slept. I'm 47 now, with kids of my own. I've never told them this story. When they ask to go camping, I always suggest beaches or open meadows, never dense forests. My wife thinks I'm overprotective. Maybe I am. But sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas at night and pass a stretch of dark woods, I roll up the windows and lock the doors. Because I know there are things out there that science can't explain. Things that watch and wait from just beyond the tree line. Things with intelligent eyes that glow orange-red in the darkness. I still wake up sometimes at exactly 1 in the morning, my heart racing, convinced there's a face at my window. And even all these years later, in the safety of my suburban home, I can't bring myself to look. Story 15. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night in late 2006. I wasn't supposed to be driving that late, but work had kept me overtime, and I just wanted to get home. I was making the drive from Crescent City back to my place near Grants Pass, a route I'd done probably 100 times before without incident. It was a cold December night, probably around 30 degrees, and I was exhausted from a 12-hour shift. My old Chevy Dually pickup, a '93 model that I'd had since college, was running fine despite having over 200,000 miles on it. That truck had seen me through a lot, and I trusted it on these mountain roads more than I would have trusted a newer vehicle. Around midnight, I pulled off at the agricultural checkpoint. We locals just call it the bug station, to stretch my legs and grab a Red Bull from my cooler. The station was closed at that hour, of course, but the pull-out area is always open. I remember standing there in the cold, my breath making little clouds in the night air, and feeling that strange silence that only happens in remote areas late at night. The kind that almost rings in your ears. I probably spent about 15 minutes there, just trying to wake myself up enough to finish the drive safely. When I got back in the truck, the dashboard clock read 12:25. I remember checking it specifically because I was calculating how much sleep I could get before my morning shift. Not enough, I figured, but I'd manage. Highway 199 through Smith River Canyon is no joke on a good day. At night, with no streetlights and nothing but wilderness on either side, it's downright eerie. The road twists and winds through the mountains, with the canyon walls rising up on one side and dropping off steeply on the other. There's barely any shoulder in some places, and the guardrails don't exactly inspire confidence. I had my high beams on, cutting through the pitch-black night. There was no other traffic, not unusual for that time and that stretch of road. I'd just come through one of the tunnels and was heading downhill into a series of S-curves. My headlights were sweeping across the road as I navigated the turns. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain didn't process what I was seeing. On the opposite shoulder of the road, walking away from me, was something big, something that didn't belong there. I slowed down instinctively, though not dramatically. When you're on roads that narrow with potential logging trucks behind you, slamming on your brakes isn't an option. But I definitely eased off the gas as my high beams fully illuminated the figure. It was massive. I'm not talking about big like a tall human. I'm talking about a creature that had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The shoulders on this thing were incredibly wide, like a bodybuilder times 2, and there was no neck visible. Its head seemed to sit directly between its shoulders in a way that no human's does. The head itself was shaped almost like a cone, wider at the bottom and tapering toward the top. And the hair, God, the hair. Long, matted, tangled hair covered its entire body, a mix of grey and charcoal with darker tones underneath. In the beam of my headlights, I could see the hair moving slightly with each step it took. Its arms hung down much lower than a human's would, with large hands that I swear had visible fingers, long ones. I could see its feet too as it walked, wide, flat, almost leather-looking things that planted with each step with a weird sort of confidence. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you might expect from something so large. It was smooth, powerful, like it absolutely owned that stretch of wilderness and was just taking a casual stroll. For about 4 full seconds, I had a clear view of it as my truck moved past. 4 seconds doesn't sound like much, but when you're seeing something that shouldn't exist, it feels like slow motion. Every detail burned into my brain. My first instinct was to turn around. I needed a second look to confirm what I'd just seen wasn't my tired brain playing tricks on me. But the road there is so narrow and winding, with so many blind curves, that attempting a U-turn would have been suicidal, especially knowing that logging trucks sometimes use that route at night. Those drivers know the road, but they take the curves fast, and they wouldn't expect to find some idiot stopped in the middle of the highway. So I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I kept checking my rearview mirror, but the creature was already lost in the darkness behind me. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing upright. No way. I've seen plenty of bears in my life, and this was no bear. The proportions were all wrong, and bears don't walk bipedally for extended periods like that. A man in a suit at 12:30 in the morning, miles from anywhere, on a freezing December night? And who makes a suit that realistic or that tall? There was only one thing it could have been, as crazy as it sounds. I'd just seen a Bigfoot. I've lived in the Pacific Northwest my whole life. I've heard the stories, of course, everyone around here has. But I'd always been skeptical. I'm not the type to believe in things without evidence. I work in construction. I deal with concrete realities every day. Myths and legends aren't my thing. Or they weren't. Until that night. The rest of my drive home is a blur. I remember stopping once at a gas station in Cave Junction, going inside just to be around normal human things. The fluorescent lights and the bored cashier were the most comforting things I'd ever seen. I bought a coffee I didn't need just to have a reason to be there. When I finally got home around 2 in the morning, I didn't sleep. How could I? I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, replaying those 4 seconds over and over in my mind, trying to find some explanation that made sense, but there wasn't one. The next day, I called in sick to work, the only time I've ever done that when I wasn't actually ill. I spent hours online researching Bigfoot sightings in the area. Turns out, the Smith River Canyon has had numerous reports over the years, some dating back decades. The details in many of them matched exactly what I'd seen. The height, the conical head, the long arms, the smooth gait. I debated whether to report what I'd seen. I even drove to the local Forest Service office, sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, then drove away without going in. What would I say? How would I explain it without sounding crazy? I didn't have any evidence, no photos, no video, nothing but my own eyes. And in today's world, that's not enough. For weeks afterward, I couldn't drive that stretch of highway without my heart rate spiking. I'd scan the trees obsessively, hoping and fearing I might see it again. I started keeping a digital camera in my truck. Not that it would do much good in the dark, but it made me feel better to have it. It's been 17 years now since that night, and I've never seen anything like it again. I've told a few close friends, but most people just give me that look. You know the one, where they're trying to decide if you're joking or if you've lost your mind. The thing that sticks with me the most isn't just what I saw, but how it made me feel. There was something profoundly unsettling about witnessing something that, according to conventional wisdom, shouldn't exist. It forces you to question everything else you think you know for certain. I still drive that route regularly. Sometimes, especially on dark winter nights, I find myself slowing down around that same stretch of road, my eyes searching the shadows beyond my headlights. Not out of fear exactly, but out of a strange hope that I might get another glimpse, maybe one that lasts longer than 4 seconds. I know what I saw that night. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, it wasn't my imagination. It was something that has probably been walking those forests since long before highways cut through them, something that has managed to stay just hidden enough to maintain its legendary status. Sometimes I wonder if it saw me too, this strange human in his noisy metal box, cutting through the night with artificial light. Did it turn to look after I passed? Did it tell others of its kind about the encounter? Or does it simply avoid the roads now, staying deeper in the wilderness where curious eyes can't find it? I'll never know. But I do know this. That 4-second encounter changed how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit neatly into our categories and explanations. And sometimes, if you're driving alone on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere, you might just catch a glimpse of them. I haven't been back to that exact spot at night since then. Somehow, it feels like tempting fate. But every time I drive through Smith River Canyon in the daylight, I can't help but look up at the dense forest on those steep hillsides and wonder, is it watching me right now? And how many other people have seen what I saw, but like me, were too afraid of ridicule to ever tell their story? Story 16. I still can't really talk about this without getting goosebumps. It happened when I was 10, back in the summer of 2007. I was staying with my grandparents like I did every summer. They had this beautiful property just outside a tiny town in central Arkansas, near the Ouachita National Forest. I loved it there. The freedom, the woods, the creek that cut through their land. It was my personal playground. That day started like any other summer day. Hot, humid, with cicadas making that endless droning sound that's basically the soundtrack of an Arkansas summer. After lunch, I was bored, and Grandma was taking her afternoon nap, so I decided to go down to the creek. I knew the property pretty well by then. My grandparents had about 12 acres, mostly wooded, with this perfect little creek running through it. The water wasn't deep, maybe up to my knees in the middle, but it was clear and cool and full of tiny fish and frogs. I remember I was wearing my favorite blue shorts and this faded Pokemon t-shirt that was way too big for me. I had these old sneakers on that were already soaked from previous creek adventures. Mum would have been mad if she saw them, but Grandma never cared about stuff like that. I made my way down the worn path from the house to the creek. It wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute walk. There was this spot I loved, a kind of natural ledge on the bank that jutted out a bit over the water. It was my thinking spot. I could sit there and dangle my feet, toss pebbles into the water, and watch the tiny ripples spread out. Sometimes I'd bring a book, but that day I just wanted to be outside, doing nothing much at all. I remember sitting there for maybe half an hour, just watching water striders skate across the surface and listening to the woods. I was collecting flat stones to skip across the water. I wasn't very good at it. I think my record was 3 bounces, but I was determined to get better. The creek wasn't very wide there, maybe 15 feet across, with dense woods on both sides. I don't know exactly what time it was when it happened, probably around 3 in the afternoon. The sun was still high, filtering through the trees in these bright beams that hit the water and made it sparkle. I remember that so clearly. I had just thrown a stone that completely failed to skip and just plopped into the water when something made me look up. I don't know if it was a sound or movement or just that weird feeling you get when something's watching you, but I looked across the creek, maybe 30 yards away, to where the land sloped up from the water. At first, I didn't really register what I was seeing. There was this thing standing there between a cluster of bushes and young trees. My first thought was that it was just a tree stump or something. You know how your eyes can play tricks on you in the woods, how shadows can look like solid things. But then it moved. I froze completely. Every part of me just locked up. There was this pine tree next to it, a young one, not very tall, maybe 8 feet at most. And this creature, it was almost as tall as the tree, 7 feet at least, maybe more. I remember thinking it had to be a bear. It had to be, but bears don't stand like that, not for that long. This thing was upright, perfectly balanced on 2 legs, not hunched over or awkward like a bear would be if it stood up. It was big, not just tall, but broad, muscular. I could actually see the muscles under its hair, especially across its shoulders and arms. The hair covering it wasn't super shaggy, but it wasn't sleek either, sort of in between and brownish gray. The sunlight was hitting it in a way that I could see the definition in its body. It looked powerful, not like an animal exactly, more like those bodybuilders you see on TV, but hairier and just different. I couldn't see its face clearly. It wasn't looking at me at first. It seemed to be listening or smelling something, its head slightly tilted like it was concentrating. I remember thinking how weirdly human that gesture was. Then, very slowly, it turned. Not fully towards me, but enough that I could see more of its profile. And then it started walking. Not towards me, thank God, but up the slope, away from the creek. It moved so normally, calmly. Its arms swung slightly at its sides, just like a person's would. It wasn't rushing or lumbering or anything, just walking away like it had somewhere to be. That's when the terror really hit me. Not because it had threatened me or even seemed to notice me, but because in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't supposed to be seeing this. This wasn't something that was supposed to exist. This wasn't something that belonged in my world of creek beds and summer vacations and grandparents' houses. I don't remember consciously deciding to move. 1 second, I was frozen, watching it walk away, and the next, I was running as fast as I could back toward the house. I didn't look back, not once. I was too scared of what I might see if I did. I remember my feet slipping on the muddy parts of the trail, how I kept almost falling, but somehow managed to stay upright. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. My ears were rushing with this weird static sound. I just kept running. When I burst into the house, I was completely out of breath. Grandma was in the kitchen starting dinner prep. She took one look at me, red-faced, sweaty, obviously terrified, and immediately asked what was wrong. But I couldn't tell her. I just couldn't make the words come out. What was I supposed to say? I saw a monster in the woods. There's a giant hairy man thing by the creek. I knew how that would sound. So I just said, I thought I saw a snake, which wasn't entirely a lie since snakes did freak me out. Grandma gave me some lemonade and told me to sit at the kitchen table for a while. I did, but I couldn't stop looking out the window toward the trees. I kept expecting to see it emerge from the woods, walking toward the house with that same calm, purposeful stride. But it never did. I didn't go back to the creek for the rest of that visit. I made excuses. It was too hot. I wanted to help in the garden. I was reading a really good book. I think Grandma knew something was off, but she didn't push it. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every rustle of leaves outside my window, I was convinced it was coming for me. Not because it had seemed aggressive or anything, just because it felt wrong, like seeing it had somehow connected us, and now it knew about me too. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been my imagination. Almost, but I knew what I'd seen. It was too detailed, too real. The way the light hit its body, the deliberate way it moved, the sense of intelligence I felt watching it. These weren't things my 10-year-old brain could have made up. I never told anyone the full story. Not my parents, not my friends. Who would believe me? But I've spent the 15 years since then trying to make sense of what I saw. I've gone back to my grandparents' place many times since then. I eventually worked up the courage to visit the creek again, though never alone. The woods feel different to me now, not necessarily dangerous, but aware, like they're keeping secrets. Sometimes when I'm there, I feel like I'm being watched, but not in a threatening way, more like I'm being checked on. I've done research over the years. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other creatures people claim to have seen in those woods. Some descriptions match what I saw, but others don't. The thing is, I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. The rational part of my brain has spent years trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a black bear with mange that made it look less furry. Maybe it was some hermit living in the national forest. Maybe it was just shadows and an overactive imagination. But the part of me that was there that day, the part that felt that bone-deep certainty that I was seeing something impossible, that part knows better. I still dream about it sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where I'm sitting by that creek again and I look up and it's there. Sometimes in the dreams, it actually turns and looks right at me. I always wake up before I can see its face clearly. The weirdest part is that I'm not even sure I want answers anymore. Whatever it was, it didn't hurt me when it easily could have. It was just existing, living its life in those woods that have probably been its home far longer than they've been my grandparents'. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen it, if some other kid exploring those woods has had the same experience I did, if they too ran home and kept the secret, knowing no one would believe them. I wonder if it's still there, walking calmly through the trees, listening to the sounds of the forest. The creek is still there, the woods are still there, and sometimes when I visit and stand at the edge of the trees looking in, I can't shake the feeling that it's still there too, watching and waiting in a world that exists alongside ours, but somehow separate from it. I don't know what it was. I don't know if I'll ever know. But I do know that since that day, I've never been able to look at the woods the same way again. They're bigger somehow, more mysterious, and definitely not as empty as we like to think they are.